In the quiet years that followed the Second World War, the world stood among ruins, cities silent, nations broken, and hearts searching for meaning. From that silence arose a courtroom, not of vengeance, but of remembrance. It was called the Nuremberg Tribunal. For the first time in human history, men who once commanded armies and empires would face not the armies of their enemies, but the judgment of law itself. In a grand hall of marble and shadow, words replaced weapons, and justice became the world's new language. The air was still, the microphones clicked, and across every continent, people listened, wondering if civilization could ever restore its soul. This was not a trial for one nation, nor for one people. It was a moment when humanity gathered to decide what it meant to be human after so much inhumanity. The judges who entered that hall carried more than robes and papers. They carried the weight of millions who could no longer speak. Each document, each photograph, each trembling voice of testimony became a thread in the fabric of truth. Tonight, we will drift through that moment slowly, gently retracing the steps of those who sought to rebuild the moral order from the ashes of war. As you listen, imagine the dim light of the courtroom, the quiet turning of pages, the steady rhythm of translators' voices echoing in many tongues. Imagine history, not shouted, but spoken evenly, deliberately, so that every word might outlast the noise of conflict. This is a story of law and conscience, of men who chose to reason instead of retaliate. It is also the story of imperfection, of a trial that struggled to balance fairness with power, mercy with memory. And yet, within that struggle, something timeless was born. The Nuremberg Trials became more than verdicts on the guilty. They became a mirror held up to civilization itself, asking a question that still lingers in every age. Can justice rise from the ruins of war? Let your mind settle as we return to those quiet chambers where words weighed more than weapons, and truth was written into history one sentence at a time. This is Lullaby of Empires. And tonight, we remember Nuremberg, the trial where humanity learned at last to speak for itself. The silence after war. The year was 1945, and Europe lay in ruins. Cities that once pulsed with life had been reduced to gray fields of rubble. The streets of Berlin, Warsaw, and Dresden stood silent beneath skies thick with the residue of fire. The war that had begun with parades and speeches ended with empty windows and broken doors. Across the continent, survivors wandered through the wreckage, searching for food, for family, for meaning. The guns had fallen quiet, but the silence that followed was heavier than sound. It was the sound of a civilization asking itself how such destruction had been possible. For 6 years, the world had lived inside a nightmare. More than 50 million people were dead, millions more displaced. Entire nations had been erased from maps, their histories rewritten in ashes. The victors had won, yet their triumph was hollow. No victory parade could erase the images of camps liberated by Allied soldiers, the skeletal survivors, the piles of unburied dead. The war had ended, but conscience had not. There was something unresolved in the air, a moral weight pressing down on a tired world. People spoke of peace, but beneath that word was another that could not yet be uttered: justice. In the bombed-out government buildings of London, Washington, Moscow, and Paris, diplomats and lawyers began to gather. They came not as soldiers, but as architects of a new kind of reckoning. The world had never seen what they were about to attempt. In previous wars, defeated leaders were executed or exiled, their crimes absorbed into the victors' histories. But this war had been different. Its crimes had not been confined to battlefields or borders. They had reached into the bedrooms and schoolrooms of Europe, into laboratories and ministries, into every corner of organized life. It was not enough to rebuild cities. The world needed to rebuild the meaning of civilization itself. From that realization came a question that would define the second half of the 20th century. Could there be justice for crimes so vast that no existing law could contain them? The idea of a tribunal began as a whisper among Allied leaders even before the war ended. As early as 1942, reports of mass murder had reached London. Governments in exile pleaded for accountability, for punishment not just of soldiers, but of those who had designed the policies of extermination. Yet it was not clear what form such justice could take. There was no international court, no agreed definition of crimes against humanity, no precedent for trying leaders of a sovereign state in a single courtroom. The Allies themselves had never attempted such a thing. Some feared that a trial might appear as vengeance dressed in legal robes. Others believed that without a trial, vengeance would rule the ruins. Out of that tension, the idea of Nuremberg was born. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, Justice Robert H. Jackson of the United States Supreme Court received a call from President Harry Truman. Jackson was known for his clarity of thought and moral conviction. The president asked him to serve as chief prosecutor for what was then called the International Military Tribunal. Jackson understood the magnitude of the task. It was not merely to prove guilt, but to prove that guilt could be defined by law. In a speech delivered in June 1945, he said, "We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow." Those words would become the spiritual foundation of Nuremberg. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin viewed the proposal with suspicion. The Soviet Union had lost more lives than any other nation in the war, and its leaders demanded swift and certain retribution. Trials, in their eyes, were unnecessary. The guilty were already known. Yet Stalin recognized the value of spectacle. The image of Nazis being judged in an international court would legitimize Soviet suffering before the world. In London, Winston Churchill was skeptical for different reasons. He favored execution without trial, fearing that long proceedings would invite sympathy for the accused. But American insistence prevailed. The United States, rising as a new moral and political power, argued that justice must be visible, not simply declared. The law, Jackson insisted, must be given a voice that could be heard across generations. By the summer of 1945, representatives of the four Allied powers, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, met in London to draft the charter that would establish the tribunal. The meetings were long and contentious. Each nation brought its own legal traditions, its own definition of justice. The British emphasized procedure, the Americans documentation, the French philosophy, the Soviets punishment. Out of these differences, something remarkable began to take shape. The London Charter defined three new categories of crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These definitions were revolutionary. For the first time in history, leaders could be held personally responsible for actions committed in the name of the state. The concept of sovereignty, once absolute, was quietly rewritten. Law would now stand above nations, not beneath them. While diplomats debated, Europe struggled to breathe again. The landscape between the Rhine and the Vistula was a graveyard. Millions of displaced persons wandered through transit camps, carrying what little they had left of home. In Germany, hunger replaced ideology. Children dug through rubble for coal. Families cooked soup from weeds. The defeated nation was divided among occupying powers, each with its own agenda. In the American zone, investigators began gathering evidence for the coming trials. Warehouses filled with captured documents, diaries, and photographs. The paper record of a fallen empire was being sorted, cataloged, and prepared for judgment. Soldiers and lawyers worked side by side, unaware that they were creating one of the greatest archives of human crime ever assembled. Elsewhere, survivors of the camps began to tell their stories. Their words were quiet at first, often broken by long silences. Many spoke through translators, their testimonies half-whispered, half-sobbed. They described trains that arrived at night, chimneys that burned day and night, families separated forever in the flick of a soldier's hand. Investigators wrote down every word. The scale of suffering was almost impossible to grasp, yet each story added another piece to a mosaic of horror. These accounts would later form the moral heart of the prosecution's case. The survivors' voices, fragile yet unshakable, would remind the tribunal that justice was not an abstract exercise but a duty owed to the living and the dead. As autumn approached, preparations turned to the question of where to hold the trial. Many cities had been proposed: Berlin, Leipzig, even Geneva. But the choice finally fell upon Nuremberg, a city symbolic to both the Nazi rise and its downfall. It was here that the party had staged its grandest rallies, the torch-lit processions that had once dazzled the world. Now the same halls would witness the undoing of those who had marched beneath the banners. The Palace of Justice, though damaged by bombing, remained largely intact and included a prison attached to the courtroom, a practical necessity. For the Allies, Nuremberg was both symbolic and logistical. For history, it was poetic. The stage of tyranny would become the stage of justice. In the months before the trial, engineers and workers transformed the Palace of Justice into a place prepared for history. The courtroom was fitted with microphones and headphones for simultaneous translation, a technological marvel of its time. Interpreters were trained to render each word into English, French, Russian, and German in real time. The wooden benches were polished, the bulletproof glass erected around the defendant's dock. Journalists from across the globe were granted seats, their pens ready to record the unfolding of a new era. Photographers tested their lights, cameramen adjusted angles. Outside, military police erected barricades. Inside, the walls seemed to absorb the weight of anticipation. Nuremberg was ready to speak. Yet even as preparations advanced, uncertainty lingered. No one truly knew how the world would react when the trials began. Would the public see them as justice or vengeance? Could any punishment match the scale of the crimes? Some critics predicted chaos. Others feared indifference. But beneath the debates lay something deeper, a collective need to understand. After years of chaos, humanity required a narrative, a structure, a way to comprehend what had happened. The trial would provide that narrative, line by line, name by name. It would attempt to turn horror into evidence and outrage into order. It would not heal the world, but it would teach it to speak of its wounds. The men who would soon stand in the dock were already in Allied custody. Hermann Göring, once the embodiment of Nazi grandeur, now sat in a prison cell dictating his memoirs. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer who had flown to Scotland in his ill-fated mission, mumbled to himself through long hours of solitude. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the suave foreign minister, wrote letters he would never send. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal, still tried to maintain a soldier's discipline, though he knew the war he fought had long been lost. They were fragments of a shattered hierarchy, stripped of insignia, reduced to numbers. Behind their arrogance, fear grew like a shadow they could not shake. In the dens of arrogance, Allied capitals, public sentiment was a mixture of satisfaction and fatigue. People were tired of war, of rationing, of newsreels filled with destruction. Yet they sensed that what was about to unfold in Nuremberg was more than another trial. It was the closing act of a tragedy that had consumed a generation. Newspapers began to print headlines about the trial of the century. Radio broadcasters prepared to relay updates from the courtroom to listeners across the world. Even in homes far from Europe, in small towns of America, in villages of Canada and Australia, people would sit by their sets, listening to the slow, deliberate voices of justice. In this new age, the microphone replaced the battlefield. Words became the new weapons, and evidence the new artillery. The courtroom would not only decide the fates of 22 men, it would decide whether civilization itself could endure. The world waited, holding its breath in the space between war and peace. In that pause, the silence of 1945 was more than an absence of sound. It was a question whispered through the ruins. After all that had been lost, could humanity ever regain its soul? The answer, though not yet spoken, was beginning to form in the quiet corridors of Nuremberg. Clerks carried stacks of translated documents. Guards rehearsed their duties. Prosecutors practiced the order of presentation. Judges studied charters late into the night. Somewhere in the city, the faint sound of hammers echoed as workers secured the final panels of glass. History was being assembled, piece by piece, patiently, deliberately, as if the act of preparation itself were a form of healing. The dawn of justice was near, and the world, still trembling from its wounds, would soon open its eyes. The birth of a tribunal. In the summer of 1945, the idea of an international court moved from speculation to reality. The war had ended, but the question of how to judge its architects remained suspended between politics and philosophy. In London, the air was thick with post-war exhaustion. Diplomats arrived in offices still scarred by bombing, the smell of dust and damp paper lingering in the corridors. They gathered around heavy oak tables, representing nations that had fought side by side, yet now carried the first seeds of rivalry. The task before them was unlike anything attempted in the history of law. They were to create a framework for judging the leaders of a government that had commanded a continent and murdered millions. No such tribunal had ever existed. The closest precedent was centuries old, when defeated kings were executed by their conquerors or quietly exiled. But this time, the victors wanted something more enduring, something that could speak not merely for revenge, but for civilization itself. The meetings began in early July, convened at Church House in Westminster. The delegations came from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Their faces showed the fatigue of men who had lived too long through war, yet behind their weariness was a sense of moral purpose. They were lawyers, judges, generals, and civil servants, each carrying the legal traditions of their homeland. For the Americans, Robert H. Jackson presided, sharp-eyed and precise, his voice measured, his patience endless. The British were led by Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, deliberate and procedural, a man of cold reason. The French sent Pierre Gros and André Gros, jurists steeped in civil law and philosophical clarity. The Soviet delegation arrived under Major General Iona Nikitchenko, who carried the authority of Moscow and the suspicion of the West. Around the table sat the uneasy alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany, now united once more to define its guilt. The first debates were technical, even mundane. How should the tribunal be structured? Who would prosecute? What rules of evidence would apply? Yet beneath each practical question was a philosophical struggle. The Americans insisted on due process and clear documentation, fearing that without legal precision, the tribunal would appear as a political show trial. The British emphasized precedent, drawing on their long traditions of common law and adversarial defense. The French argued for principles that the trial must stand as a declaration of universal justice, not merely national vengeance. The Soviets spoke less of law and more of punishment, insisting that the crimes of fascism were beyond debate and should be treated as such. For weeks, these differences collided across tables, littered with papers and translation notes. Interpreters whispered into microphones as tempers rose and fell. The war was over, yet its ideological echoes lingered in every sentence. From these arguments, the London Charter began to take shape. Its text was written and rewritten through long nights filled with cigarette smoke and the clatter of typewriters. Paragraph by paragraph, the foundation of modern international law was laid. Article 6 would define the crimes for which the defendants could be charged: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Each phrase carried weight that would resonate through generations. Crimes against peace, the planning and waging of aggressive war, was a new idea, born of the conviction that war itself must be restrained by law. War crimes, the violation of existing conventions governing prisoners, civilians, and conduct of armies, codified centuries of military ethics. Crimes against humanity, the systematic murder, enslavement, and persecution of civilians, was the most radical of all, asserting that the conscience of mankind transcended national boundaries. When Jackson read the draft aloud, even the most skeptical delegates paused. In those few pages, law had leapt beyond the nation-state, yet nothing in those rooms came easily. Each delegation had to compromise, often painfully. The Soviets resisted limits on the tribunal's authority, arguing that guilt was self-evident. The Americans insisted that every defendant must have counsel, that every charge must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The British demanded meticulous record-keeping, knowing history would scrutinize every word. The French pressed for language that would give the trial philosophical depth, transforming it from punishment into precedent. There were quarrels about procedure, about who could be indicted, about how evidence should be handled. Some nights ended in silence, delegates retreating to their quarters, convinced the effort would collapse. Yet by the end of July, a consensus emerged. The London Charter would serve as the legal backbone of the tribunal. It would stand as a document born not from one nation's will but from the uneasy collaboration of four. On the 8th of August 1945, the charter was signed. The ink was still wet when the news reached the world. Newspapers carried headlines declaring the birth of a new age of justice. Beneath the surface of celebration, uncertainty persisted. What the charter promised in words, the tribunal would have to prove in action. Could law truly rise above politics? Could men who had commanded armies be judged by the same principles as ordinary criminals? These questions hung over the project like mist over a battlefield. But for the first time, there was a structure, a name, and a city. Nuremberg would become the stage on which these questions would find their answers. As plans solidified, the Allies turned to the practical task of gathering evidence. Teams of investigators scoured the ruins of Germany, seizing documents from ministries, military headquarters, and abandoned bunkers. Millions of pages were collected, orders signed by Hitler, memos from Himmler, blueprints for camps, transport lists from the Reichsbahn, photographs of deportations, films taken by German cameramen documenting the very crimes they later denied. Each box of papers was a record of the regime's self-destruction. The Nazis had been meticulous bureaucrats. Their obsession with record-keeping became the prosecution's greatest weapon. In warehouses converted into archives, young soldiers and typists cataloged the materials under the supervision of lawyers. The evidence grew into mountains of paper that would soon fill the courtroom. Every signature, every stamp, every photograph was a thread in the fabric of guilt. Meanwhile, preparations in Nuremberg continued. The Palace of Justice buzzed with engineers and carpenters. The translation system was tested repeatedly. The judge's bench was elevated to create clear sight lines across the chamber. Rows of desks were arranged for defense counsel, each supplied with headphones and microphones. Behind the glass wall, the defendant's dock took shape, a long enclosure of dark wood and steel. Military guards rehearsed their routines, learning to stand motionless through hours of testimony. Outside the courthouse, barbed wire fences enclosed the building. Within its perimeter stood the adjoining prison, where the 22 principal defendants awaited trial. Inside the cells, the men who had once ruled Germany adjusted to confinement. Hermann Göring remained defiant, still seeing himself as a statesman rather than a criminal. Rudolf Hess oscillated between lucidity and delusion, convinced his capture had cosmic meaning. Joachim von Ribbentrop brooded over his downfall, his vanity undimmed. Wilhelm Keitel tried to preserve the habits of command, saluting guards as they passed. Others sank into apathy, their authority evaporating like smoke. Psychologists visited them, taking notes for future studies of evil and obedience. Journalists speculated about their mental states, though the world already believed it knew their guilt. Each man awaited the same moment, the day when the world would look upon him and ask for explanation. As autumn deepened, delegations of judges and prosecutors arrived in Germany. The British sent Lord Geoffrey Lawrence and Sir Norman Burkitt, men of composure and restraint. The Americans appointed Francis Biddle, former Attorney General, whose even tone masked a fierce sense of justice. The French delegation included Henri Donadieu de Vabres and Robert Falco, scholars of international law. The Soviets sent Iona Nikitchenko, already known for his role in Stalin's purges, and his alternate, Alexander Volchkov. Together, they formed a panel unprecedented in human history, 4 nations sitting in judgment of one. Their robes differed in color and cut, their languages clashed, their philosophies diverged, yet all were bound by a single task. In their hands rested the authority not merely to punish, but to define. By late October, the prosecution had prepared a list of the accused and the charges they would face. The names were familiar to every newspaper reader: Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Kaltenbrunner, and others. Each was accused under one or more counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The indictments filled hundreds of pages. Translators worked day and night to render them into 4 official languages. The date of the opening session was set for the 20th of November 1945. The world now had a calendar for justice. In the weeks before the trial, the mood in Nuremberg was somber. Allied soldiers patrolled streets still littered with debris. Civilians moved quietly, aware that their city had become the focus of the world's gaze. Hotels were requisitioned to house staff and journalists. Cafeterias served meager rations under military supervision. In the evenings, the faint glow of lights from the Palace of Justice was visible across the river. Inside, clerks typed transcripts, guards rotated their watches, and translators rehearsed simultaneous delivery. Every detail mattered. The world's first trial of international leaders could not afford a single flaw. In Washington, President Truman prepared a brief statement. "The trial of the Nazi leaders," he wrote, "is a solemn warning to all who plan and wage aggressive war." Similar sentiments echoed from London and Paris. In Moscow, the official press described the coming tribunal as the judgment of the people. Yet beneath these proclamations lay anxiety. No one could predict how the defendants would behave. Would they confess or deny? Would they attempt to justify their actions under the banner of patriotism? And above all, would the tribunal maintain unity under the pressure of ideology and national pride? On the evening before the opening session, a cold rain fell over Nuremberg. The city, scarred by bombing, was eerily quiet. Inside the Palace of Justice, guards checked the locks, reporters laid out their notepads, and prosecutors rehearsed their opening words. In a nearby cell, Göring wrote his final statement of defense, convinced he could outtalk any accuser. In another, Rudolf Hess sat motionless, staring at the wall. The prison clock ticked through the night. By dawn, the air carried the faint smell of coal smoke and wet stone. Columns of military vehicles moved through the streets, their headlights cutting narrow paths through the mist. Soldiers in American uniforms took their positions at the courthouse gates. In the corridors, the sound of footsteps echoed. Clerks straightened stacks of documents. Interpreters adjusted their microphones. The judges assembled in their chambers, robes folded neatly across their laps. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors to the courtroom opened. The first trial of its kind in human history was about to begin. The birth of the tribunal was complete. The concept that began as an idea in London had taken physical form, a courtroom of wood and marble, filled with the weight of human conscience. The world, for a moment, stood still. The guns were silent, the armies disbanded. Yet in Nuremberg, a new kind of battle was about to commence, not of nations, but of principles. The Palace of Justice, the morning of November 20th, 1945, dawned gray and heavy over the city of Nuremberg. Mist clung to the broken rooftops and the skeletal ruins of buildings that once echoed with marching boots and fanfares. Now, those same streets were lined with Allied guards. Armored jeeps idled beside piles of debris, their engines humming faintly in the cold air. Civilians moved quietly, keeping their distance from the Palace of Justice, where history was about to awaken. Inside, lights flickered to life in long corridors lined with freshly painted walls. Soldiers, clerks, translators, and journalists moved with purpose, each aware that they were witnesses to something larger than themselves. The war had ended, but within these walls, its echo was about to be judged. The Palace of Justice stood on Furtherstrasse, its gray stone facade scarred but still commanding. Before the war, it had housed the regional courts of Bavaria, a symbol of order in a world that had since collapsed into chaos. The Allied occupation had chosen it for practical reasons. It was one of the few surviving structures large enough to contain the machinery of justice, and, importantly, it had an adjoining prison. The symbolism, however, was unmistakable. This was the same city where Adolf Hitler had once declared his laws of racial purity. The same city that had hosted rallies where tens of thousands had saluted in unison under banners of blood and fire. Now, those halls of spectacle had fallen silent, replaced by the deliberate rhythms of legal order. The stage of tyranny was about to become the stage of truth. Inside the main courtroom, every detail had been arranged with precision. The benches gleamed with new varnish, the judge's platform raised to overlook the defendant's dock. Rows of desks stretched across the room for prosecutors, defense counsel, and interpreters. Wires ran beneath the floorboards, connecting a network of microphones and headsets that allowed for simultaneous translation in English, French, Russian, and German, a technological marvel for its time. The interpreters sat in glass booths above the courtroom, each listening intently, their voices low and steady, ensuring that every word spoken could be understood by all. The air smelled faintly of ink, varnish, and the cold metal of microphones. The defendants entered under heavy guard. 21 men filed into the dock, their footsteps muffled on the wooden floor. They wore plain suits, stripped of medals and insignia. Only Hermann Göring still carried himself with an air of defiant pride. Once the master of the Luftwaffe, now he looked around as if trying to reassert his vanished authority. Beside him sat Rudolf Hess, eyes vacant, muttering softly to himself. Joachim von Ribbentrop, once the polished diplomat of the Third Reich, avoided every gaze, his expression frozen between arrogance and disbelief. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal, stiffened into the posture of a soldier at attention. One by one, they took their seats, politicians, generals, ideologues, administrators, the architects of a war that had consumed the world. When the judges entered, the room rose. Lord Geoffrey Lawrence of Britain, calm and dignified, presided as the court's president. To his right sat Francis Biddle of the United States, measured and contemplative. The French and Soviet judges completed the bench, their expressions stern yet watchful. Behind them, clerks and stenographers prepared to record every word. The hum of machinery faded. The silence that settled was profound. It was the silence of a world waiting for justice to speak. The clerk called the court to order. Each defendant stood as his name was read aloud. Their voices, once accustomed to command, now sounded small in the vastness of the chamber. Some replied firmly, others hesitated, their answers barely audible. Hermann Göring's voice rang clear and defiant. "I am not guilty." Keitel's was low, almost resigned, not guilty in the sense of the indictment. Julius Streicher, the propagandist whose words had poisoned millions, stared into space before mumbling his denial. The echo of those words, "not guilty," seemed to linger longer than they should have, a reminder that justice begins in contradiction. Robert H. Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, rose to deliver his opening statement. His presence was calm, his words deliberate. Every syllable was chosen to carry weight, not anger. "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish," he began, "have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored." His voice filled the room without raising in volume. Around him, journalists took notes in silence, the clicking of typewriter keys mingling faintly with the translator's whispers. Jackson continued, speaking not just to the judges, but to the entire world listening through radio and newsprint. He described how the Nazi leadership had turned law into an instrument of tyranny, how they had planned aggressive war, enslaved nations, and murdered millions in cold efficiency. His tone never wavered. It was not rage, but moral certainty. When he spoke the words, "The record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow," the courtroom seemed to exhale. Outside, reporters ran to telephones to send his words across continents. Newspapers would call it one of the greatest speeches of the century, a sermon delivered through law. Jackson's statement set the moral tone of the tribunal. The trial would not be an act of vengeance, but a reckoning before the conscience of mankind. The crimes to be proven were not against nations, but against humanity itself. For those listening on radios in London, New York, and Paris, it was as though civilization, wounded but still standing, had found its voice again. Over the following days, the prosecution began to unfold its evidence. Mountains of documents were wheeled into the courtroom, orders bearing the signatures of the accused, minutes from secret meetings, coded telegrams that detailed invasions, deportations, and executions. The scale of bureaucracy was overwhelming. The Nazis had left behind a paper trail so vast that even their most monstrous acts had become administrative routines. The judges listened patiently as translators read memos line by line, describing how nations had been dismembered with the stroke of a pen. The courtroom became both archive and graveyard, where words replaced corpses as witnesses. The press gallery was filled each day. Correspondents from across the world watched the proceedings, their notebooks filled with observations not only of law, but of human frailty. Some described Göring's restless confidence. Others noted the pale detachment of Rudolf Hess. The Bonadist cameras, though few, captured moments that would later become icons of history, the defendants whispering behind the glass, the prosecutors surrounded by mountains of evidence, the silent faces of the judges beneath their robes. To the outside world, the images of Nuremberg carried both fascination and sorrow. It was the first time the instruments of justice had been turned toward those who had wielded total power. For the people of Germany, the trial was a strange spectacle. Radio broadcasts carried summaries of the proceedings, though many listeners turned away. Some were weary of guilt, others skeptical of Allied motives. Yet even in their silence, the significance of Nuremberg began to seep into consciousness. The crimes revealed were undeniable. The words read aloud were not Allied inventions, but German orders, German policies, German signatures. For those who still clung to denial, the evidence unfolded like a mirror too clear to shatter. Inside the courtroom, the rhythm of proceedings became almost ritualistic. Mornings began with the defendants escorted to their seats, guarded by American military police in white helmets. The interpreters took their places in glass booths. The judges entered, robes swaying gently, and the day's testimony began. Afternoons carried the slow march of evidence. Documents projected onto screens, photographs shown in dim light, the quiet murmur of translators repeating each word 4 times over. Occasionally, the monotony broke when a witness was called a survivor from the camps, a military officer, a bureaucrat. Their words filled the chamber with the weight of lived horror. The court listened, the world listened, and for a brief moment, silence followed each testimony, heavy and unbroken. Every evening, the defendants were led back through underground tunnels to their cells. The prison was connected directly to the courtroom by a corridor of stone and iron, ensuring they never saw the outside world. In the dim light of their cells, they paced, wrote, or stared at the ceiling. Some talked to their guards, others to themselves. Göring continued to plot his rhetorical triumphs, convinced he could win sympathy. Keitel prayed, Ribbentrop wept in secret, Julius Streicher muttered scripture distorted by hate. The once mighty rulers of Europe now waited in narrow rooms, hearing through faint echoes the distant sound of their own judgment. At night, the Palace of Justice seemed almost peaceful. The corridors, once crowded with clerks, grew quiet. The lamps cast long shadows across the courtroom benches. A few soldiers stood guard by the doors, their rifles glinting faintly under the light. In the interpreter booths, the headphones hung motionless, wires coiled like sleeping serpents. The documents rested in neat piles on tables, silent witnesses to a century's darkest chapter. The city outside lay in darkness, the ruins of old Nuremberg whispering with wind and memory. In those early weeks of the WWII tribunal, something remarkable began to emerge. For the first time, nations once at war sat together in deliberation. The American, British, French, and Soviet judges, though often divided by ideology, shared the same solemn task. They represented the fragile hope that law could bridge the fractures of humanity. Each evening, when they returned to their quarters, they carried with them the faces of the accused and the words of the witnesses. They knew that their verdicts would not only decide the fate of 22 men, but would define the very meaning of justice in the modern world. As winter descended over Nuremberg, snow began to fall on the shattered rooftops. Inside the Palace of Justice, the heaters rattled softly. The translators' voices became slower, the prosecutors' eyes heavier from weeks of reading and listening. Yet the rhythm of the trial continued, steady and unbroken. The world was learning to listen to the evidence, to the witnesses, to the law itself. In that courtroom, civilization was slowly rebuilding its faith, in order, word by word, testimony by testimony. By the end of the first month, the Palace of Justice had become more than a building. It was a symbol, a place where human conscience stood against the ruins of violence. Within its walls, the world saw that even after the most terrible of wars, it was still possible to speak of truth. The structure that had survived bombs now held the weight of redemption. It was not just a court, it was a cathedral of memory, where the voices of the dead and the living met beneath the gaze of justice. The evidence of atrocity, the weeks that followed, the opening of the tribunal, unfolded with a rhythm both slow and relentless. Each morning, the defendants were brought from their cells through the cold corridor connecting the prison to the courtroom. The guards' boots struck the stone in measured cadence, echoing faintly against the walls. In the dock, the 21 men took their usual seats, their faces pale under the courtroom lights. Outside, snow gathered in the ruins of Nuremberg, softening the jagged edges of destruction. But inside, the air remained heavy, dense with the weight of what was being revealed. The tribunal had moved beyond its formal beginnings. Now came the heart of its work, the presentation of evidence. From the start, the prosecution's strategy was methodical. There would be no grand theatrics, no emotional appeals. The crimes of the Reich would be revealed through its own words, its own records, its own machinery. The Allies had seized millions of documents, telegrams, decrees, speeches, minutes of meetings. Each page bore signatures that once commanded armies and extermination squads. The Nazis had chronicled their own downfall with bureaucratic precision. Every crime had a paper trail, every order a witness. In that mountain of files lay the anatomy of a state built on conquest and murder. The first to present was the American delegation, led by Justice Robert Jackson and his team of prosecutors. Their case focused on the charge of crimes against peace, the deliberate planning and waging of aggressive war. The court listened as a map of Europe was unrolled before them, marked with the lines of invasion from Poland to France, from Norway to the Balkans, from North Africa to Russia. Each campaign was traced back to secret conferences and written orders signed by the defendants, sitting only a few feet away. The prosecution read from records of meetings where Hitler and his generals discussed the destruction of nations as calmly as if they were drawing up trade routes. The documents spoke of operations disguised as self-defense, invasions justified by fabricated incidents, treaties signed and broken within months. Göring's name appeared again and again as the architect of economic preparation for war, Ribbentrops as the manipulator of foreign ministries, Keitels as the obedient executor of every military decree. One memo detailed the invasion of Poland with chilling simplicity, destruction of Polish forces in the shortest possible time, ruthless and energetic action. The words were read in English, then repeated in French, Russian, and German. The translation flowed like a somber chant, echoing through the courtroom until meaning transcended language. Next came evidence of the war itself, the occupation, and the devastation that followed. Witnesses from occupied Europe described how German armies had imposed terror as policy villages burned, hostages executed, entire populations uprooted. Films shot by Allied cameramen were projected onto a screen for the judges to see. They showed bombed cities, lines of civilians fleeing along roads littered with wreckage, and columns of prisoners shuffling through snow. The images were grainy, flickering, but their power was undeniable. Each frame carried a truth that words could only approximate. For those watching, it was as if the war had returned to life inside the courtroom. Then came the evidence that would define Nuremberg forever, the proof of atrocities committed not merely as acts of war, but as acts of ideology. The term crimes against humanity moved from the charter's pages into the realm of reality. The prosecution introduced reports from concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, Majdanek. They read from captured correspondence between SS officers detailing quotas of deportations and daily executions. The audience listened in stunned silence as numbers were recited, not as statistics, but as the arithmetic of annihilation. One by one, the documents unfolded, the machinery of genocide. The Einsatzgruppen reports described the shootings of Jews, Roma, and political prisoners on the Eastern Front. They listed totals of deaths as if they were inventory: 33,771 at Babi Yar, 17,000 at Kamenets-Podolsk, 42,000 at Riga. Each number represented a village, erased, a community silenced. The men who had written those reports had signed them proudly, confident they would be read only by superiors who approved. Now, those same signatures were illuminated before the world as evidence of murder. The French prosecutors took their turn, focusing on crimes committed in Western Europe, deportations from France, massacres in Oradour-sur-Glane, and the enslavement of civilians for forced labor. They described how entire families had been taken from their homes, packed into trains, and sent east, never to return. The courtroom translators struggled to keep pace with the emotion carried in the French advocates' voices. Behind the dock's glass wall, some defendants shifted uncomfortably. Göring smirked. Ribbentrop stared at the floor. Keitel sat rigid, his hands clenched on the rail before him. Only Hans Frank, the former governor of occupied Poland, seemed visibly shaken. His face had grown ashen, his gaze hollow. When the Soviet prosecutors began their presentation, the tone grew even more somber. Their evidence came from the liberated territories of Eastern Europe, where the scope of destruction had defied comprehension. They showed photographs of mass graves uncovered in the forests of Smolensk and Kiev, of burned villages and skeletal survivors. Their witnesses spoke of starvation, forced labor, and executions carried out under German occupation. Though the Soviets had their own political motives, the testimony they presented was undeniable. The crimes had been vast, methodical, and deliberate. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was a film titled Nazi Concentration Camps, compiled by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. When the lights dimmed, the courtroom fell into complete silence. The screen flickered to life, showing footage taken during the liberation of camps across Germany and Poland. Emaciated survivors stumbled toward the camera, their faces hollow, their eyes unfocused. The images moved slowly, as if time itself had been slowed to force the viewer to look. Corpses lay stacked in heaps beside barracks. The lens lingered on open pits where thousands had been buried. Allied soldiers were seen lifting the living from among the dead. The room remained utterly still. When the lights came back on, there were no words. Reporters later wrote that the silence lasted for minutes. Even the defendants, who had spent their lives in denial or arrogance, seemed momentarily broken by what they had seen. Göring's face was expressionless. Keitel's head hung low. Some of the judges stared into the distance, as though unable to meet each other's eyes. Jackson himself sat motionless, his pen still in his hand. The film had accomplished what no argument could. It forced the world to witness the truth unfiltered. In the days that followed, survivors took the stand. Their voices were quiet, their words simple. but their testimonies carried more power than any document. They spoke of families torn apart at train stations, of children separated from mothers, of the endless roll call at dawn, and the smoke that rose from chimneys at night. One woman described how she had survived because the guards had mistaken her for a worker. Another recounted how her husband had been shot for sharing bread. Each story added weight to the mountain of evidence already presented. The judges listened without interruption. Occasionally, one would remove his glasses, pressing his fingers to his eyes. The defense sat in uneasy silence. Their strategies' claims of ignorance, obedience, or patriotism began to crumble under the avalanche of proof. No denial could stand against the documents, the film, the witnesses. The Reich had left too many traces of itself. Every order, every train schedule, every ledger page told the same story. The trial had become a mirror in which the Nazi regime was forced to look upon its own reflection. For the journalists, the evidence transformed the courtroom into a place of collective mourning. They wrote of the faces of the breeding holonet, judges, of the quiet dignity of witnesses, of the unbearable stillness that followed each revelation. Newsreels carried images of the courtroom to cinemas across the world. Audiences watched in disbelief as the crimes of the Reich were laid bare. Letters poured into newspapers from ordinary citizens expressing shock, grief, and guilt. The word Holocaust had not yet entered common language, but the world had seen its meaning. As the weeks stretched into months, the prosecution's case continued with mechanical thoroughness. The focus shifted to the economic exploitation of occupied territories, the enslavement of millions for forced labor, the plundering of art and resources. Each revelation added another dimension to the portrait of organized cruelty. Economists, engineers, and bureaucrats took the stand, describing how industries had profited from slavery, how ministries had turned genocide into logistics. The testimony revealed a civilization that had weaponized its own efficiency. In the evenings, when the courtroom emptied, the Palace of Justice grew quiet again. The documents remained stacked on the prosecutors' tables, the lights dimmed, and the walls seemed to breathe with the weight of memory. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the ruins of Nuremberg in a fragile whiteness. Soldiers on night watch sometimes paused by the courthouse windows, looking at the faint glow inside. They could not hear the words spoken there, but they knew that something sacred was happening, a reckoning not only for Germany, but for all humanity. By the end of that winter, the evidence phase had revealed more than crimes. It had revealed the nature of evil itself, not as chaos, but as order. The court had seen how murder could wear the face of administration, how cruelty could be written in reports and sealed with official stamps. The Nazi regime had turned death into paperwork, atrocity into routine, and through the patient unveiling of each document, each testimony, the tribunal had shown that truth, however unbearable, could still be spoken aloud. When the prosecution finally rested its case, the judges were left with thousands of exhibits, hundreds of hours of testimony, and a courtroom that had become a monument to remembrance. The world now understood that what had happened was not an accident of war, but the deliberate design of a state. Justice, slow and methodical, had stripped away every pretense. The age of silence was ending. Humanity had found its voice, and it spoke through the evidence of atrocity. The film that spoke for the dead. The day the film was shown began like any other session of the tribunal, yet there was a stillness in the air that even the guards could sense. Outside, the city of Nuremberg remained quiet under a pale winter sky. Smoke from wood fires drifted over the ruins, curling in thin spirals above the broken rooftops. Inside the Palace of Justice, the familiar routines unfolded. Clerks carried stacks of papers, translators tested their microphones, and the judges took their seats in solemn silence. But the air felt heavier than usual, as if the building itself knew that what was about to be seen would change the way humanity looked at itself. When the clerk announced that the prosecution would present motion picture evidence, a faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Cameras had documented the liberation of the camps, but few present had seen the full extent of what those reels contained. The defendants sat expressionless, some with hands folded, others glancing at the rows of journalists waiting behind them. Hermann Göring adjusted his glasses, his features tightening in irritation. Rudolf Hess muttered under his breath, while Joachim von Ribbentrop avoided all eye contact. In the front row of the press gallery, war correspondents prepared to record every detail. The lights dimmed, a projector whirred to life at the back of the room, its beam cutting through the cigarette smoke that hung in the air like a ghost. The first frames flickered onto the screen. The film began without narration, only a short title, Nazi concentration camps. The silence that followed was absolute. The images unfolded slowly, methodically, as if the camera itself had known it was witnessing something beyond comprehension. Emaciated survivors reached out toward Allied soldiers, their arms like branches stripped of bark, their faces sunken, eyes staring into the lens with hollow confusion. The footage moved through the barracks rooms filled with the dead, their bodies stacked in neat piles, limbs intertwined like firewood. The camera did not flinch, nor did it hurry. Each image lingered long enough for its meaning to sink into the viewers' minds. In the courtroom, the sound of the projector was the only noise. Even the translators fell silent. The judges sat motionless, their faces illuminated by the pale light from the screen. For many, it was the first time they had seen what had only been described in words. The horror was no longer abstract. It had shape, texture, and movement. The film moved from camp to camp, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Allied medics were shown examining prisoners too weak to stand, their ribs pressing against parchment-thin skin. Bulldozers pushed bodies into trenches while officers stood nearby, their expressions grim and unguarded. There was no attempt at sentiment, no music, no commentary. The images spoke with their own terrible eloquence. When the film reached the footage from Auschwitz, the air in the courtroom seemed to thin. The screen showed piles of children's shoes, suitcases labeled with names, and mountains of hair cut from the heads of victims. Allied cameramen had filmed the gas chambers, the furnaces, and the ash pits. The camera followed soldiers as they opened the doors of crematoria, still warm from use. The audience could see the claw marks on the inside of metal walls where people had fought for breath. For a moment, even the whir of the projector seemed too loud. Among the defendants, reactions varied. Göring sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if sheer willpower could erase what he saw. Keitel bowed his head, his hand covering his face. Ribbentrop stared straight ahead, his pupils flickering in the dim light. Julius Streicher muttered something inaudible, his face twisted between denial and pride. Hans Frank, who had governed occupied Poland, began to weep quietly, his shoulders trembling. For once, words failed them all. The evidence had no need of translation. When the final reel ended, the lights came up slowly. The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was not the polite pause of a courtroom, but something deeper, almost sacred. The judges did not speak. The spectators did not move. Even the guards stood frozen, their hands still gripping their rifles. Minutes passed before anyone could bring themselves to breathe deeply again. One journalist would later write that it felt as if the walls themselves were mourning. Robert Jackson rose to speak, his voice quiet but steady. He reminded the court that the footage had been verified by multiple Allied military units, filmed immediately upon the liberation of each camp. This, he said softly, is not propaganda. It is testimony. It is the truth of what we fought against. His words echoed gently across the room, measured and restrained. He explained that the film was compiled not for persuasion, but for history, to ensure that future generations could never say they had not known. The judges conferred briefly, confirming that the film would be entered into evidence as Exhibit USA 79. It was an unprecedented act. Never before in a court of law had moving pictures been used as proof. The camera had become a witness that could not be cross-examined, a recorder of truth that defied denial. The tribunal had pioneered not only a new standard of justice but a new way of remembering. In the days that followed, the impact of the screening rippled far beyond the courtroom. Newspapers described it as the moment when disbelief ended and knowledge began. Civilians across the world saw excerpts in newsreels that accompanied films in local cinemas. People who had doubted reports of Nazi atrocities were confronted with the undeniable. Letters poured into Allied offices from viewers who wrote of sleepless nights, of weeping in theaters, of shame that such things could have happened in the heart of Europe. Diplomats cabled their governments, calling the film overwhelming and irrefutable. The images had burned themselves into the collective memory of humanity. For the survivors who later testified, the film was both validation and torment. Many had spoken for months without being believed, their words dismissed as exaggerations born of trauma. Now, their truth was visible for all to see. Yet seeing the camps again, even on film, reopened wounds that would never heal. Some wept as they described recognizing the places where they had suffered. Others sat in silence, their faces blank, as if the screen had reflected back their own ghosts. The court became both tribunal and memorial, where justice and grief intertwined. Among the judges, the film left a lasting mark. Men who had seen battlefields confessed privately that they were unprepared for what they had witnessed. Some could not sleep that night. The images had pierced beyond law, beyond politics. They had revealed the core of what the tribunal was meant to confront: the calculated destruction of human beings, not for power, not for strategy, but for ideology. It was a moment when even the language of law seemed insufficient. Reporters covering the trial described the day of the screening as a turning point. Until then, the tribunal had been a legal proceeding. After that day, it became something else, an act of collective remembrance. The film had stripped away the distance between evidence and emotion. It forced everyone in that room to feel the weight of the crimes, not as jurists or observers, but as human beings. One correspondent wrote that the light from the projector was like the light of judgment itself, cold, merciless, and pure. Outside the Palace of Justice, the world absorbed the news with quiet disbelief. In cafes and homes across Europe, people gathered around radios and newspapers, trying to comprehend what had been shown. The words concentration camp took on a meaning that would never again be abstract. The photographs printed in the following weeks of skeletal prisoners, of piles of shoes and glasses, were drawn from the very footage shown at Nuremberg. The visual proof became the language of memory. In the months that followed, historians, theologians, and philosophers would debate the meaning of that day. Some said it marked the true birth of international conscience, the moment when the world collectively acknowledged evil in its purest form. Others saw it as the beginning of the modern age of documentation, where the lens replaced the witness. But for those who were there, no analysis was necessary. They remembered only the silence, the smell of the room, the hum of the projector, and the feeling that something irrevocable had been revealed. The film had done what words could not. It bridged the gap between accusation and belief, between history and memory. It turned atrocity into evidence, and evidence into legacy. From that day forward, the camera would no longer be just an observer of war, it would be its conscience. When the court resumed its regular proceedings, the tone had changed. Even the defense attorneys, once confident and combative, spoke in hushed tones. They could no longer deny the enormity of what had been shown. The film had removed the possibility of ignorance. Each argument of obedience or patriotism sounded hollow against the images that still lingered in the minds of all who had seen them. The defendants themselves seemed smaller, their words echoes in a room already filled with ghosts. By the time the day ended, night had fallen over Nuremberg. The lights inside the Palace of Justice glowed faintly against the dark sky. Guards stood watch in silence, their faces drawn. In the prison wing, the condemned sat alone in their cells. Some wrote letters, others stared into nothingness. They could hear, faintly, the sounds of the projector still being packed away, as if the ghosts of its images lingered in the air. The world had seen what they had done. and there was no hiding left. The courtroom would host many more days of testimony, of argument and denial, but none would ever match the quiet power of that day. The film had spoken for the dead with a clarity that no lawyer or witness could surpass. It had turned the machinery of justice into an instrument of remembrance, and though the reels would one day fade, their light would remain an unblinking witness to the darkest truth of the 20th century, the collapse of denial. In the wake of the film's screening, the tribunal entered a different kind of silence. It was not the procedural quiet of a courtroom between testimonies, but something deeper, a stillness of conscience. The images had stripped away the veil that words could not pierce. For the first time since the proceedings began, even the most skeptical observers sensed that denial was beginning to fracture. The defendants who had entered the dock each morning with pride or indifference now sat in subdued unease. Their eyes no longer met those of the judges. The rhythm of the trial changed. Every new piece of evidence was now viewed through the lens of the undeniable. In the days that followed, the prosecution resumed its steady march through documents and testimonies, but the air was different. The legal arguments continued, yet the moral verdict had already begun to take shape. When survivors took the stand, they spoke into a room that now believed them. Their voices, once strained against disbelief, found an audience ready to listen. The judges leaned forward more often, their questions gentler, their faces etched with fatigue and reflection. The trial, once dominated by lawyers and generals, had shifted into something larger, a reckoning between truth and the human capacity to look away. Hermann Göring remained the exception. He still carried himself with the same defiant bearing that had marked him from the first day. Behind the glass of the dock, he whispered to the other defendants, sometimes smirking, sometimes laughing under his breath. He was still the self-appointed leader among them, still convinced he could outtalk history. But even his bravado had begun to crack. The film had shaken him. Guards reported that he spent long hours pacing his cell afterward, muttering about Allied hypocrisy and the fate of Germany. His voice, once booming and confident, had grown hoarse. In public, he was the showman still. In private, he was a man cornered by evidence he could not deny. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as cross-examinations began. Each defendant was now forced to confront the very documents that bore his name. The prosecution, meticulous and patient, presented orders, signatures, and transcripts that turned denials into confessions. Göring, once again, was the centerpiece. He entered the witness stand with his characteristic flair, adjusting his uniform jacket and greeting the judges with a faint smile. The moment his testimony began, it became clear that he intended to turn the trial into his final stage. His words came polished and deliberate. He argued that the Nazi leaders had merely acted as any great power would, seeking security and expansion. He insisted that history had always been written by victors and that Germany's actions were no different from those of the Allies in their empires. To him, the war was not a crime, but a failed contest of ambition. Robert Jackson, calm and precise, began his cross-examination. The room fell silent as he walked slowly toward the stand, carrying a thin folder of papers. His questions were direct, his tone measured. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Piece by piece, he dismantled Göring's narrative. He presented documents showing Göring's role in authorizing the persecution of Jews, in seizing their property, in coordinating deportations under the guise of economic efficiency. Jackson's voice remained steady as he read Göring's own words, allowed memos and decrees that stripped entire communities of their rights. The courtroom listened as Göring attempted to justify each act as state policy, his confidence faltering with each page. When Jackson turned to the subject of Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass that marked the beginning of open terror, Göring's composure slipped. "Did you not call the meeting?" Jackson asked. "Where you decided that Jewish businesses should be fined for the destruction of their own property?" Göring hesitated. "Yes," he admitted finally, his voice low, "but it was necessary to maintain order. The simplicity of that sentence, "it was necessary," hung in the air like an accusation against an entire regime. Jackson did not respond. He simply nodded, turned another page, and continued. The exchange became one of the defining moments of the trial. The world heard it broadcast on radio and printed in newspapers, the master of propaganda reduced to defending bureaucracy. Göring had hoped to use the stand as a platform, but instead it became his undoing. The facade of control cracked under the weight of evidence. Even among his fellow defendants, admiration gave way to resentment. They watched as his arrogance drew scorn from judges and prosecutors alike. For many, it was the moment when the illusion of dignity that had surrounded the Nazi leadership finally collapsed. As Göring's testimony continued, the other defendants were brought forward one by one. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, took the stand next. His defense was fragile, his words disjointed. He claimed ignorance of the extermination policies, insisting that he had only handled diplomatic matters. But the documents told another story. Telegrams bearing his signature revealed his active involvement in the deportations of Jews from occupied France and Hungary. He had personally pressured ambassadors to accelerate the solution. When confronted with the evidence, Ribbentrop's composure shattered. He denied, contradicted himself, and finally fell into silence. The polished diplomat who had once dined with kings now stood as a man drowning in his own lies. Wilhelm Keitel followed, a soldier to the end. His voice trembled as he read from prepared notes, insisting that he had merely obeyed Hitler's orders. He spoke of loyalty, of discipline, of the fear of disobedience, but the obeyed prosecution reminded him of the countless signatures he had placed on orders that sanctioned the execution of prisoners, the destruction of villages, the starvation of millions. When asked if he had ever protested, Keitel bowed his head and whispered, "No." The word echoed through the chamber. For all his talk of duty, he had never once resisted. His obedience had not been heroism, it had been the quiet engine of atrocity. One after another, the defendants' testimonies dissolved under scrutiny. Alfred Rosenberg, the ideological architect of racial supremacy, spoke of philosophy and history, claiming that he had been misunderstood. But when confronted with his writings, the venomous theories that had justified genocide, he fell silent. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking surviving SS officer, denied knowing of the concentration camps until documents surfaced bearing his approval of their operation. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, broke into tears as he admitted guilt, calling himself a miserable man. For a brief moment, contrition entered the courtroom, fragile and uncertain. The judges observed these unravelings with steady eyes. They had begun to see the pattern clearly. Behind the facade of ideology and command lay ordinary vanity, fear, and ambition. The men who had plunged the world into chaos were not monsters from legend, but men who had chosen obedience over conscience, power over humanity. Their denials collapsed, not under emotion but under the weight of their own handwriting. The public followed the cross-examinations with rapt attention. Newspapers printed excerpts of testimonies, their front pages filled with the faces of the accused. The tone had shifted from fascination to pity, from curiosity to moral exhaustion. The more the defendants spoke, the smaller they seemed. Their eloquence turned to dust against the evidence projected before the world. For many readers, it was the first time they saw the Nazi elite not as demonic figures but as frail men stripped of myth. Outside the Palace of Justice, the city of Nuremberg remained a landscape of ruins. The snow that had once covered its broken stones was melting into gray slush. Children scavenged for coal among the debris, women queued for bread, and Allied soldiers patrolled streets that still smelled faintly of ash. Yet within that desolation, something faint and fragile was beginning to take root, the idea that law could rebuild what war had destroyed. The trial had become a symbol of moral reconstruction, not only for Germany but for the world. Inside the courtroom, the days grew longer and the nights colder. The translators' voices, once brisk, began to slow with fatigue. The judges' faces showed the weariness of months spent listening to horror, yet the work continued with quiet determination. Each session, each testimony, each document added another thread to the tapestry of truth. Justice was not swift, but it was steady. By the time the defense had finished its final statements, the transformation was complete. The arrogance that had entered the courtroom in November 1945 was gone. What remained were hollow faces, drained of conviction. Göring no longer smirked. Ribbentrop avoided all eyes. Keitel prayed softly before being led away. Their defenses had been heard, but their words carried no weight. The evidence had spoken louder. When the judges adjourned that evening, the courtroom remained empty for a long time. The air still seemed to vibrate with echoes of testimony, the confessions, the denials, the silences. The clerks stacked their papers, the guards turned off the lights, and the great room returned to its stillness. Yet, the weight of what had been said lingered. In that silence, the world had seen something extraordinary. The collapse of denial, the moment when lies, repeated often enough to become history, finally broke beneath the simple force of truth. The judges of Nuremberg, the men who sat upon the raised dais of the Palace of Justice, carried upon their shoulders a burden heavier than any verdict. They were not merely jurists, but witnesses of history, entrusted with deciding not only the guilt of individuals, but the moral direction of civilization itself. Each morning, as they entered the courtroom, the defendants would rise, and the air would fall still. The sound of robes brushing against the polished wood, the soft scrape of chairs as they took their seats, it was a quiet ritual, repeated hundreds of times, yet it never lost its solemnity. Behind them, the flags of the four Allied powers hung heavy and still, their colors dimmed by the winter light filtering through the tall windows. At the center sat Lord Geoffrey Lawrence of Britain, the presiding judge, whose calm demeanor seemed to anchor the proceedings. A man of composure and precision, Lawrence spoke rarely but decisively, his rulings measured and free of spectacle. His face revealed little emotion, yet beneath that restraint lay the weight of one who understood the fragility of law when placed before the enormity of human cruelty. To his right was Francis Biddle, the American judge, tall and dignified, his gaze thoughtful, his manner tempered by the liberal ideals of his homeland. He had once served as Attorney General of the United States under Roosevelt, and his presence embodied a quiet moralism, an insistence that justice must remain reasoned even when emotion threatened to overwhelm it. Beside them sat the French judge, Henri Donadieu de Vabres, a scholar of international law whose sharp intellect contrasted with his weary eyes. France had suffered deeply under occupation, and for him, Nuremberg was both a courtroom and a memorial. His French eloquence softened his severity, but those who knew him said his judgments carried the cool clarity of principle forged in loss. And finally, at the far end of the bench, sat Major General Iona Nikitchenko, the Soviet judge, stoic, inscrutable, his expression carved from stone. A veteran of Stalin's courts, he had presided over trials where verdicts were often foregone conclusions. At Nuremberg, he represented a nation both victor and violator, a contradiction embodied in the very seat he occupied. Together, these four men formed the spine of a tribunal, unlike any before it, a court born of war, yet reaching for universality. Behind them sat alternate judges and advisors, interpreters, and clerks, but it was their collective gaze that gave the proceedings their gravity. Each came from a different legal tradition, a different philosophy of justice. The British and Americans favored due process and precedent. The French approached the law through ideals of moral duty and civilization. The Soviets viewed it as an instrument of state power. To blend these into one coherent voice required constant negotiation, patience, and restraint. The miracle of Nuremberg was not only that justice was done, but that it was done through harmony among such disparate systems. In private, their chambers were filled with the quiet murmur of translators and the rustle of papers. The judges worked late into the night, poring over volumes of testimony, drafting opinions, and debating principles that had never before been tested. They faced questions that no court had answered. Could individuals be punished for obeying their state? Could war itself be declared a crime? Could a government's leaders be held accountable before the law of all humanity? These were not legal abstractions, but moral frontiers. The judges walked them carefully, aware that their every word might echo across centuries. Francis Biddle, in his diary, wrote of sleepless nights and moral unease. He admired the fairness of the proceedings, yet felt the shadow of contradiction, the knowledge that the victors were judging the vanquished, that the Allies themselves were not free of reproach. He confided to colleagues that the principle of crimes against peace, though necessary, stretched the boundaries of law. Yet he believed in its moral truth, in the need to draw a line between defense and aggression. Without this, he wrote, civilization will forever repeat its madness. Lord Lawrence, meanwhile, wrestled with balance. His duty was to keep the courtroom from descending into passion or politics. He maintained a tone of quiet order, guiding the proceedings with patience that concealed exhaustion. Even when tensions flared between prosecutors, between the judges themselves, Lawrence's steady hand restored calm. Observers noted that his impartiality gave the tribunal its dignity. He treated the defendants not as monsters, but as men before the law. That distinction, subtle but profound, ensured that Nuremberg would not become an act of vengeance. The French judge, Donadieu de Vabres, approached the task with philosophical rigor. To him, Nuremberg was not merely about punishment, but about defining civilization's boundaries. He argued often for clarity of legal reasoning, insisting that justice must never rely solely on morality, lest it become the tool of power. Yet even he admitted, in later writings, that logic could not contain what they had witnessed. The crimes defied language, and at times the law seemed too narrow a vessel for such enormity. Still, he persisted, shaping the concept of crimes against humanity into a legal category that would outlive them all. Nikitchenko, the Soviet judge, remained the most enigmatic. To many Western observers, his presence seemed paradoxical, the representative of a system that itself had employed purges and show trials. Yet within the tribunal, he performed his role with discipline, rarely speaking, but always firm in his convictions. When disagreements arose, he defended the Soviet position with unwavering certainty. His belief in collective responsibility sometimes clashed with Western individualism. Still, even his presence served a purpose. It reminded all present that justice at Nuremberg was not pure, but human, a fragile construction shaped by politics as much as by principle. Each day, the judges faced the faces of the accused, men who had once commanded armies and nations. They watched them deny, argue, justify, and occasionally break. They listened to the lawyers' arguments, the witnesses' tears, the endless documents cataloging cruelty turned into routine. And each evening, when the courtroom emptied, they returned to their quarters carrying that weight. Theirs was a solitude unlike any other, the solitude of those who must decide not only what men had done, but what mankind should never do again. The strain showed. Clerks recalled seeing Lawrence staring for long minutes at the empty courtroom after adjournment, as though speaking silently to the ghosts that hovered over the wooden benches. Biddle would pace his chambers, chain-smoking as he reread transcripts, searching for balance between mercy and truth. Donadieu de Vabres took long walks in the courtyard, his scarf trailing behind him in the cold wind, muttering about the moral limits of law. Even Nikitchenko, usually impassive, was seen one night sitting motionless by his window, the glow of his cigarette the only light in the dark. Their debates were intense but respectful. They argued about definitions, about what constituted aggression, about the meaning of conspiracy, about the line between obeying and commanding. They clashed over sentencing, over philosophy, over the language of the final judgment. Yet through these disagreements ran a thread of shared purpose. Each judge understood that they were not merely adjudicating a trial, they were crafting the foundation for a new world order. The lessons they inscribed would become the backbone of future international law. When the tribunal finally moved toward its conclusion in mid-1946, the judges began drafting their opinions. The work was immense. Thousands of pages of testimony had to be distilled into clarity. Each charge had to be weighed against the mountain of evidence, each defendant judged individually. There were nights when Lawrence's candle burned past midnight, when Biddle's notes filled entire notebooks, when the translators' voices grew hoarse from dictation. And still they pressed on, aware that the world waited for their words. Their greatest challenge was to maintain fairness. It would have been easy to condemn all 21 men alike, to let outrage replace discernment. But the judges refused. They separated the planners from the executors, the fanatics from the opportunists. They acquitted where doubt remained, proving that justice, even when born from war, could remain impartial. To many observers, this restraint was Nuremberg's greatest triumph, that even after unimaginable crimes, the law did not descend to vengeance. By October 1946, the verdicts were ready. The judges gathered one last time in the quiet of their chambers. Outside, autumn leaves fell softly upon the ruins of Nuremberg. Inside, their final deliberations were hushed, their voices steady, their pens deliberate. Lawrence read through the final draft, his hand trembling slightly. Biddle signed with a heavy sigh, writing later that he felt no triumph, only sorrow. The French judge crossed himself before signing, whispering a prayer for the dead. Nikitchenko, as always, signed without expression. The verdicts would be announced publicly in the coming days, and history would remember that moment, the solemn reading of justice in the same land where tyranny had once spoken with thunder. But for the judges, the true verdict was internal. They had stared into the darkest heart of mankind and had chosen to answer not with rage, but with reason. In doing so, they had restored faith in something fragile yet enduring, the belief that even after war, humanity could still speak in the language of law. When the courtroom lights were finally dimmed that night, the judges' benches stood empty, their papers neatly stacked, the flags motionless in the still air. The Palace of Justice was silent again, but beneath that silence lay something new, the first heartbeat of international justice, faint but steady. The men who had delivered it would fade into history, their names remembered only in footnotes and archives. But the principle they gave life to, that no power stands above, accountability would endure. And in the quiet halls of Nuremberg, long after the last echo of boots and gavels had faded, that principle would remain like a whispered vow between the living and the dead. Verdicts at midnight, the autumn of 1946, descended quietly over Nuremberg. The war-scarred city, still half in ruins, lay beneath a pale German sky that never seemed to brighten. The Palace of Justice, its stone walls blackened by soot and years of grief, stood solemn against the chill wind. Inside, the different tribunal had reached its end. The last arguments had been spoken, the final witnesses dismissed, and now the world waited. For nearly a year, the judges had listened to voices of guilt and denial, to testimonies of horror and suffering. They had heard the cries of the dead in the words of the living. And now, behind closed doors, they began the work that would turn all those voices into judgment. The deliberations were long and heavy. Day after day, the judges met in private chambers, surrounded by endless stacks of documents. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint smell of ink. Every word, every phrase of the final judgment had to be precise, for these sentences would outlive them all. Geoffrey Lawrence presided over the sessions with his usual calm, but those who saw him noted the deep shadows beneath his eyes. Francis Biddle, weary from months of moral labor, read aloud passages that he feared might sound too harsh or too lenient. Donadieu de Vabres demanded clarity, his voice cutting through the fatigue like a steady bell. Nikitchenko spoke rarely, but when he did, his tone was firm, as if he were pronouncing destiny rather than debate. Their task was immense. 21 men awaited their decision, soldiers, ministers, ideologues, and bureaucrats, each responsible in his own way for a world consumed by fire. The judges had to weigh law against conscience, precedent against morality. No court before them had faced such a question: how to sentence those who had waged war not merely against nations, but against humanity itself. Each defendant's fate would be a symbol, a reflection of what civilization intended to do with its own darkness. The deliberations stretched into nights without sleep. Papers rustled endlessly, pens scratched against parchment. Sometimes there was silence, sometimes quiet argument. The judges debated what distinguished guilt from obedience, intent from circumstance. They spoke of Göring's arrogance, of Keitel's obedience, of Ribbentrop's deceit, of Speer's charm, of Hesse's madness. There were disagreements. The Soviets pressed for broader punishment, arguing that mercy would weaken justice. The Western judges insisted that fairness was strength, not weakness. To condemn without distinction, they said, would make the law no different from vengeance. Hours passed in that balance between rigor and humanity. In one session, Lawrence looked up from his papers and said softly, "The world will not remember how harsh we were, but how fair." His words settled over the table like a benediction. Even Nikitchenko, who rarely showed emotion, nodded slightly. In the end, fairness would be their monument. By the last week of September, the judgments were complete. Each judge signed his name to the final document, hundreds of pages that chronicled crimes, reasoning, and sentences. There was no celebration, only silence. The law had spoken, but it had spoken through weary men. As the papers were sealed, Lawrence removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, and whispered, "May history find this sufficient." None of them answered. There was nothing more to say. The date for the verdicts was set, October 1st, 1946. That morning, the streets of Nuremberg filled with the muffled sound of footsteps. Journalists, soldiers, and diplomats gathered outside the Palace of Justice. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of burned wood from nearby stoves. Inside, the courtroom filled early. Reporters filled the press gallery. Officers lined the walls in silence. The defendants sat in the dock, their headphones waiting, the glass barrier reflecting their pale faces. For the first time in months, even Göring looked uncertain. He sat upright, his hands folded tightly before him, his mouth set in a grim line. At precisely 10 a.m., the judges entered. Everyone stood. The room seemed to exhale and then fall utterly still. Lord Lawrence took his seat at the center and began to read. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the chamber with the gravity of a bell tolling for the dead. The words were simple, almost clinical. Each name was called in turn, each verdict delivered without flourish. The sentences were not shouted, not dramatized. They were spoken as though carved into stone. Hermann Göring guilty on all counts. The former head of the Luftwaffe blinked once, then stared ahead with frozen composure. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an outcome he had already foreseen. His lips moved, forming silent words no one could hear. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty on all counts. Ribbentrop's face went pale. He looked toward his interpreter, as if hoping the words might have been mistranslated. They had not. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty on all counts. The field marshal stood briefly, saluted the judges, then sat again without a word. One by one, the sentences continued. The voice of law moved through the list of names with relentless steadiness. Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Julius Streicher, Fritz Sockel, Alfred Jodl, all condemned to death by hanging. Others received long prison terms. Hess, Speer, and Funk were sentenced to life. Von Neurath to 15 years, Dönitz to 10. A few, like von Papen and Schacht, were acquitted, though their reputations were forever destroyed. The rhythm of the reading had the solemn inevitability of a litany. Each name was a memory of devastation, each sentence an epitaph. The courtroom remained silent except for Lawrence's voice and the occasional rustle of paper. Some defendants sat motionless, their eyes downcast. Others fidgeted, whispered, or stared defiantly into the distance. Hans Frank wept quietly, his shoulders trembling. Julius Streicher muttered under his breath, his face twisted with hate. Göring remained rigid, his expression mask-like, his pride unbroken. As the final words were read, "The tribunal is now adjourned," the sound of the gavel echoed through the hall, sharp and final. No applause followed, no sound at all, only the shuffling of guards and the faint clink of handcuffs. The trial that had begun with the ambition of justice had ended in the stillness of judgment. The men who had once commanded armies now stood as prisoners awaiting their end. Outside, the world learned of the verdicts within hours. Radio stations across continents interrupted broadcasts. Newspaper presses roared to life, printing headlines that would define the century: Nazi leaders sentenced 12 to die. Crowds gathered around bulletin boards and kiosks, reading the names aloud in disbelief. In cities still bearing the scars of bombing: London, Warsaw, Moscow, Paris, people wept, cheered, or simply stared at the paper in silence. For survivors of the camps, it was not joy they felt, but a quiet release. Justice, however imperfect, had spoken. In the cells beneath the Palace of Justice, the condemned men waited. Guards reported that the corridors were hushed, the atmosphere heavy but controlled. Göring requested writing materials and began composing letters, part confession, part justification. Ribbentrop prayed aloud. Keitel wrote a farewell to his wife, signing it, "Your faithful soldier to the end." Julius Streicher paced endlessly, muttering slogans that now belonged to ashes. The others sat in silence, each confronting a truth they had spent their lives denying. As night fell, the judges met one last time. They gathered in the same chamber where they had first convened a year earlier. There were no speeches, no photographs, no signatures left to make, only reflection. Lawrence spoke quietly, thanking his colleagues for their endurance. Biddle nodded, too tired for words. Donadieu de Vabrez closed his notebook and placed it gently on the table. Nikitchenko, ever formal, saluted once before leaving the room. When the door closed behind them, the sound seemed to mark the end of an era. At midnight, the Palace of Justice stood silent beneath the stars. A few lights still glowed in the upper windows where guards kept watch. The city outside slept uneasily, unaware that within those walls, the modern world had just been born, a world where law, not revenge, had spoken the last word. In the days that followed, preparations began for the executions. The gallows were erected in the prison gymnasium, sturdy and plain. The American hangman, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, tested the ropes with grim efficiency. Witnesses were chosen, doctors assigned, reporters approved. Everything was to be done with precision, without spectacle. Justice, they said, must be carried out not in anger, but in solemn duty. On the evening before the executions, Göring cheated the gallows. Hidden in his cell, he swallowed a vial of cyanide that he had somehow managed to conceal through months of searches. When the guards found him, he was already dead, his face calm, almost smug, as if he had claimed the final act for himself. The discovery spread quickly through the prison, leaving a bitter taste even among the victors. Yet the executions proceeded as planned. At 1:01 in the morning, on October 16, 1946, the first prisoner was led into the gymnasium. The witnesses stood in a semicircle, the air thick with tension. Each man ascended the scaffold in turn. Some prayed, some cursed, some said nothing at all. The trapdoors fell, one after another, with the dull finality of history closing upon itself. By dawn, it was over. 10 bodies lay still, their lives extinguished beneath the weight of their own crimes. Outside, the river waited. The ashes of the executed were scattered into its gray waters, carried downstream into anonymity. No graves, no monuments, no place of pilgrimage, only the current, slow and indifferent, washing the last traces of empire away. When the news reached the world, there was no triumph. There was only quiet. In London, in Moscow, in Washington, people read the headlines and folded their newspapers without comment. The war, it seemed, had finally ended not with a battle, but with a whisper. For the judges who had presided, the verdicts marked both an ending and a beginning. They returned to their countries, to quieter lives, but none were untouched. Lawrence never spoke publicly about his feelings, though he was seen years later standing before the ruins of Nuremberg Cathedral, lost in thought. Biddle retired into reflective silence, his memoirs filled with melancholy. Donadieu de Vabres returned to teaching, shaping a generation of jurists who would carry his ideals forward. Nikitchenko resumed his duties in Moscow, his role at Nuremberg, praised by some, forgotten by others. But their legacy endured. The sentences they pronounced that autumn night became the cornerstone of international law. The words spoken in that quiet courtroom gave birth to principles that would one day govern tribunals in The Hague, Rwanda, and beyond. In the stillness of October 1946, humanity had judged itself and for the first time had chosen law over vengeance. And so, the Palace of Justice returned to silence. The flags were lowered, the benches stood empty. Outside, the leaves fell upon streets, still haunted by the echoes of boots and the whispers of judgment. The trial was over, but its shadow would never fade. Somewhere in the distance, the river carried its burden onward, past fields and villages, toward the sea, a silent witness to the night when justice, weary but unbroken, finally spoke for the world. Echoes through the world. In the weeks that followed the verdicts, the world began to breathe again, though softly, as if uncertain it still knew how. The ruins of Europe, stretching from the Channel to the Volga, lay beneath gray autumn skies. Smoke still rose from the rubble in some cities, the smell of ash and damp stone mixing with the scent of new bread from makeshift bakeries. The war was over, but its echoes still hung in the air, carried by the wind that swept through hollow streets and empty cathedrals. In that fragile quiet, the names read aloud in Nuremberg began to drift outward across borders, across oceans, across memory itself. The world listened, some with relief, some with anger, some with disbelief. In the Allied nations, the response was somber satisfaction. Newspapers called the tribunal the victory of law over barbarism. Radio announcers, their voices hushed by the weight of history, spoke of justice finally done. In London, people gathered outside newsstands in their coats and hats, reading the headlines in silence. A few nodded grimly, others turned away. In Paris, cafe patrons murmured over their morning coffee, their faces lined by both age and memory. The French press called it La Justice du Monde, justice of the world, though some wondered whether justice could ever be equal when it was written by victors. In Moscow, banners proclaimed the verdicts as proof of Nazi guilt and Soviet virtue, though the irony was lost in the thunder of propaganda. Across the Atlantic, in American living rooms filled with the soft glow of radio lamps, listeners heard the words, "crimes against humanity," and knew, perhaps for the first time, what that phrase meant. The reactions were as varied as the nations themselves. For the Allies, the trial was a moral anchor, proof that their suffering and sacrifice had been for something larger than victory. For the vanquished, it was a wound reopened, a mirror held to a face they no longer wished to see. Within Germany, the verdicts arrived like a whisper in a country still stunned by defeat. The cities were silent, not in defiance, but in fatigue. The people had nothing left to protest. For many Germans, Nuremberg was not a moment of enlightenment, but of numbness. The words guilty and justice meant little to those living in ruins. The sentences felt distant, almost unreal, as if belonging to another world. There were, of course, murmurs of defiance. Some former officers called it hypocrisy. They spoke of Dresden, of Hiroshima, of Soviet camps in the East. In taverns and drawing rooms, the phrase "victor's justice" passed from lip to lip, often whispered, sometimes shouted. Yet even among them, few dared to deny the truth entirely. The evidence had been too overwhelming, the photographs too clear. The film reels shown at the tribunal had been distributed across Europe. They played in cinemas and churches, projected onto the walls of schools. People filed in quietly, watched in silence, and left without words. Denial had no place left to stand. For the survivors, the verdicts were something more than law, they were acknowledgement. In displaced persons camps, where those who had endured the unimaginable now lived among the remnants of war, the news spread quickly. Men and women gathered around wireless radios or scraps of newspapers, passed from hand to hand. Many wept, though not out of joy. They wept because the world had finally heard them. For years, they had carried memories that few believed. Now, those memories had been written into history by judges' hands. The names of their tormentors were condemned, their crimes named for all time. It was not revenge they felt, but a quiet relief, as if a long-forgotten prayer had finally been answered. In the ghettos that no longer existed, in the forests where partisans once hid, in the ashes of towns erased from maps, the verdicts seemed to echo like faint voices returning from silence. Synagogues, long abandoned, reopened their doors, their walls whispering the names of the dead. Churches held vigils not only for the fallen soldiers, but for the civilians who had vanished in the machinery of occupation. Across Europe, candles were lit in windows for those who had not returned. Nuremberg had become, in its own way, a requiem not only for justice but for remembrance. Far beyond Europe, the trial's impact spread to places that had never seen its courtroom. In India, lawyers and scholars debated the meaning of universal justice under colonial rule. In China, where Japanese war crimes were being examined, the Nuremberg precedent offered a path toward accountability. In the United States, universities added new courses in international law, inspired by the precedent of the tribunal. And in the halls of the United Nations, newly formed in the same year, diplomats began to discuss the idea of a permanent system of international courts, a dream that would take decades to realize, but whose roots were planted in those cold Nuremberg mornings. Among philosophers, the tribunal sparked deeper reflection. Writers in London, Paris, and New York wrestled with the meaning of morality in a century that had known industrialized murder. Could law truly restrain evil, they asked, or was it merely a fragile bandage over human cruelty? Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the trials, wrote that justice must not only punish but understand, that the world needed to confront not just what had been done, but how ordinary men had done it. Her words echoed the unease that lingered beneath the triumph. For though the tribunal had condemned individuals, it had also exposed something broader, the terrible capacity of civilization itself to destroy. As the months passed, Nuremberg's influence deepened. The phrase, "crimes against humanity," entered the language of nations. No longer confined to courtrooms, it became a moral compass. Treaties, conventions, and declarations followed in its wake. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded upon its principles, protecting prisoners of war and civilians alike. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, drew directly from its legacy, proclaiming that every human being possessed inherent dignity. In these documents, the voices of the judges still lingered, their careful phrasing, their measured tone, their conviction that law must stand above the whims of power. Yet even as the ideals of Nuremberg spread, the world returned to its old habits. The Cold War began to harden, dividing the same allies who had once sat side by side in the Palace of Justice. East and West turned suspicion upon one another. Propaganda replaced cooperation. The Soviets invoked Nuremberg to condemn Western actions. The West invoked it in return. The tribunal that had once united humanity against evil now became a weapon in the new war of words. Justice, like peace, proved fragile. In Germany, the memory of the trials faded quickly. Rebuilding took precedence over reflection. By the 1952, new industries rose from the ruins, and former party members quietly re-entered public life. For many, Nuremberg became a closed chapter, something distant, uncomfortable, best left to historians. Yet beneath the surface, the moral shock it had delivered continued to work, slow and invisible, shaping generations to come. The children of those who had lived through the Reich would grow up asking questions their parents could not answer. The guilt of a nation, suppressed at first, would resurface decades later as a collective reckoning. Across the ocean, in America, the trials became symbols of moral leadership. The prosecutors, once young and idealistic, returned home as advocates for international justice. Robert Jackson resumed his duties on the Supreme Court, carrying with him the lessons of Nuremberg. He had seen the limits of power and the necessity of restraint. His words from the opening statement that the record of the trial must stand as a warning for the future would be quoted in classrooms and courtrooms for generations. Even in defeat, the trial's defendants became part of history's lesson. The images of Göring's defiance, of Ribbentrop's collapse, of Keitel's salute before the noose, entered the public imagination as symbols of arrogance meeting consequence. The photographs of the courtroom, with its wooden benches and heavy flags, became icons of moral authority. Artists painted it, filmmakers recreated it, teachers used it as proof that justice could exist even after catastrophe. But perhaps the most enduring echo of Nuremberg was not legal, nor political, but human. It reminded the world that even after total destruction, it was possible to rebuild meaning. The tribunal had not restored the dead, nor erased the pain of millions, but it had drawn a line faint, imperfect, yet visible between civilization and chaos. It had said, quietly but firmly, that law could be stronger than hate. Years later, when other wars erupted, when other crimes darkened new corners of the earth, people would look back to that quiet German city and remember, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, new tribunals would be born, each invoking the spirit of Nuremberg. In every courtroom where victims faced their tormentors, where truth was spoken after years of silence, that same principle lived again, that even in a broken world, justice must speak. As the 1,940 seconds gave way to the new decade, the Palace of Justice returned to its ordinary function. Trials of lesser officials continued in its halls, but the great courtroom no longer drew crowds. The benches grew dusty, the translation headsets hung unused. Outside, the city rebuilt slowly, its streets filling with the hum of commerce and the laughter of children. The war had become memory, Nuremberg, a chapter in history. But for those who had sat there, the judges, the prosecutors, the witnesses, the sound of that gavel would never fade. And so, the echoes spread, soft but enduring. Across continents and generations, in classrooms and courts, in the quiet prayers of survivors and the written words of scholars, the name Nuremberg came to mean something more than a place. It became a promise that truth, though slow, would always find its voice. That justice, though imperfect, was the only answer to evil. And that even after the darkest night, humanity could still awaken to conscience. The world moved on, as it always does. But somewhere, in the depths of memory, the verdicts of 1,946 continued to speak calm, unhurried, and eternal. The trials beyond Nuremberg. When the last echoes of the gallows faded and the Palace of Justice grew silent, many believed the story of Nuremberg had ended. But justice, once awakened, is not easily returned to sleep. The Allies knew that the crimes of the Third Reich had not been confined to the men who had sat in the dock. The machinery of destruction had required thousands of hands, and the courtroom had room for only a few. So the Americans decided that the work must continue. Within the same gray walls, beneath the same cold light, 12 new trials would unfold, quieter perhaps, less public, but no less important. These would not concern the generals and ministers who planned war, but the doctors, judges, and industrialists who had given it flesh. They were called the subsequent Nuremberg Trials, and they began in December 1946, only weeks after the executions. The world outside had already begun to move on, yet within those walls, the shadow of the Reich still lingered. The defendants this time were not men of war, but men of intellect and profession. Scientists, lawyers, corporate magnates, officials in suits who had never fired a shot, yet whose signatures had condemned thousands. They were the hidden architects of cruelty, those who had lent legitimacy to murder and profit to suffering. The first was the doctor's trial. 23 physicians stood accused of turning healing into torture. Their crimes had taken place not on battlefields, but in laboratories and barracks, where human beings were treated as material. In Dachau, in Ravensbrück, in Buchenwald, doctors in white coats had carried out experiments in freezing and altitude, disease and dissection. Prisoners were plunged into ice water to study hypothermia. Others were deliberately infected with malaria or typhus. Some were mutilated in surgical trials meant to simulate battlefield wounds. For these men, science had become an instrument of ideology. The prosecution's evidence was unbearable in its detail. Photographs of victims, scarred and broken, were displayed in the courtroom. Witnesses spoke through tears of the agony they had endured. One woman described being forced to stand in a freezing tank until her body could no longer tremble. Another told of experiments where bones were shattered and reset for no reason but curiosity. The doctors, in their defense, argued that they had acted in the interest of medical progress, that the war had demanded sacrifice, that other nations had done the same, but their words fell hollow against the evidence of suffering. In August 1947, the verdicts were read. 7 of the doctors were sentenced to death, others to prison, and 7 were acquitted. But from that trial came something greater than punishment, a new moral law. The Nuremberg Code, born from the ashes of their crimes, declared that no experiment could be conducted without voluntary consent. It stated that the welfare of the subject must always outweigh the goals of science. For the first time, the sanctity of the human body was written into universal principle. The Hippocratic Oath, once betrayed, was restored in a language of law. The next to stand trial were the judges' men who had turned the law itself into a weapon. They had sentenced innocents to death in the name of ideology, replacing justice with obedience. 16 jurists and officials from the Ministry of Justice were brought before the bench. Their courtroom, filled with irony, was the same one in which they had once condemned others. The prosecution charged that they had given the appearance of legality to terror, drafting decrees that stripped citizens of rights, justifying sterilization, and overseeing the so-called people's courts, where guilt was predetermined and dissenters hanged within hours. The defendants protested that they had merely enforced the laws of their nation, that a judge's duty was to apply the statutes before him, but the tribunal rejected this defense. It declared that legality was no refuge for injustice, that law divorced from conscience was no law at all. 4 were sentenced to life imprisonment, others to shorter terms, and 4 were acquitted. The judgment reaffirmed what the first Nuremberg had begun, that moral responsibility does not end at the edge of authority. In 1948 came the turn of industry. The corporations that had profited from slavery and death were called to account. Among them were the chemical giants of IG Farben, whose factories had produced synthetic fuels and rubber for the Wehrmacht, and Zyklon B gas for Auschwitz. Their executives, dressed in fine suits, argued that they had been businessmen, not killers, that they had supplied materials, not death. But witnesses from Monowitz, the labor camp built beside their plant, told a different story. They spoke of 12-hour shifts without food, of beatings, of exhaustion so deep that workers collapsed by the hundreds. The company, they said, had requested slaves, not employees. The tribunal listened in silence. When the verdicts came, 13 of the 24 defendants were found guilty of plunder and enslavement. Their sentences were modest, a few years, none to death, but their convictions carried moral weight. For the first time, commerce itself was held accountable for complicity in atrocity. The message was quiet but profound. Profit is not innocence. Other trials followed. There was the Flick trial, the Krupp trial, the Ministries trial, each peeling back another layer of collaboration. The Krupp family, pillars of German industry for a century, had forged weapons and used slave labor on a massive scale. Alfred Krupp, heir to the empire, sat in the dock accused of exploiting tens of thousands of prisoners. His defense was familiar: necessity, coercion, duty. But the evidence showed otherwise. His factories had expanded eagerly into occupied lands. His company had grown fat on conquest. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, though he would serve only 3 before being released. The ministry's trial exposed the bureaucrats, the quiet administrators of horror. These were the men who had written the orders, stamped the papers, managed the trains that carried millions to their deaths. Their guilt was measured not in blood but in ink. Yet the judges saw through the facade of routine. They ruled that paperwork could be as deadly as a weapon. Through these trials, justice continued its slow march, though its steps grew heavier. The world beyond Nuremberg had grown restless. The Cold War was tightening its grip, and political priorities began to shift. The United States, once relentless in its pursuit of punishment, now saw West Germany as a potential ally against the Soviet Union. As tensions rose, leniency followed. Sentences were reduced, prisoners released early, industrialists like Krupp returned to their factories, reclaiming fortunes and influence. The moral clarity of the tribunal began to blur into the pragmatism of politics. Yet, even this imperfect justice left a mark. The documents, the testimonies, the photographs became a record no one could erase. The words spoken in those smaller, quieter trials echoed beyond their verdicts. They reached classrooms, universities, and parliaments. They formed the moral backbone of what would later be called human rights law. Even where punishment faltered, truth had been established. In the years that followed, the ideas born in Nuremberg began to travel. When the world met again to write the Geneva Conventions, they carried with them the lessons of those trials. When nations debated the meaning of genocide, they turned to the definitions forged in that courtroom. And when, decades later, new atrocities emerged in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in the Balkans, it was the Nuremberg Code, the Nuremberg Principles, the Nuremberg spirit that returned to guide judgment. The doctors who had mutilated bodies had inadvertently shaped the future of medical ethics. The judges who had betrayed the law had helped define its limits. The businessmen who had exploited suffering had forced the world to question the morality of profit. Out of their crimes, humanity had written new commandments. By 1949, the final trial concluded. Nearly 200 defendants had stood in the dock across those years. Some walked free, some served time, and a few met the gallows. But beyond their sentences, something greater had been achieved. The idea that individuals, regardless of rank or profession, could be held responsible for crimes against humanity had taken root. The world had seen, in meticulous record, how ordinary lives could become instruments of evil, and how law, if vigilant, could call them to account. As the last gavel fell, the Palace of Justice returned to silence once more. The translators' booths were empty, the benches bare, the microphones unplugged. Outside, the city of Nuremberg continued its slow resurrection. Children played in the courtyards where tanks had once stood. The air smelled again of bread and rain instead of dust and smoke. But the walls of that courtroom still carried the memory of voices of witnesses trembling, of judges reasoning, of humanity learning to judge itself. The subsequent trials did not carry the grandeur of the first, nor its global audience. Yet they completed its work. They reached into the everyday structures that had sustained atrocity and declared them guilty. They transformed justice from a single event into a process, imperfect, fragile, but enduring. And though politics would later temper its edge, the principle remained that no doctor, no lawyer, no magnate, no official, however powerful, could claim ignorance or immunity when faced with the suffering of others. In the quiet aftermath, when the world turned to rebuilding, the memory of these trials lingered like a steady flame. Their judgments became chapters in the long story of human conscience, written not with triumph, but with humility. Nuremberg had begun as a reckoning. It ended as a lesson that power without morality leads to ruin, that knowledge without compassion breeds cruelty, and that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of guilt. And so, in the fading light of that post-war decade, the Palace of Justice stood as both monument and warning, a reminder that civilization's strength lies not in its armies or its wealth, but in its capacity to confront its own sins. The trials beyond Nuremberg had shown that justice, though slow and imperfect, could still be the conscience of the world. The moral debate, victor's justice, the verdicts of Nuremberg had been rendered, the gallows taken down, and the world seemed ready to move forward. Yet, beneath the solemn closure, a question began to whisper through the halls of universities, the offices of diplomats, and the quiet reflections of philosophers. It was not a question of guilt, for the guilt had been undeniable, but of fairness. Had justice truly been done, or had the victors simply written morality in their own image? The phrase victor's justice began to circle the post-war world like an uneasy ghost, haunting the triumph of law with the suggestion that even righteousness might wear the colors of power. It was not the condemned who first gave this phrase life, though they had spoken it loudly enough from the dock. It was thinkers and jurists, some sympathetic, others merely cautious, who wondered whether the tribunal had crossed the line between justice and vengeance. The Allies had accused Germany of waging aggressive war, of violating international treaties, of committing atrocities so vast that language itself had to invent new crimes to describe them. But in the rubble of a world still learning to breathe again, some asked whether law could be created after the act. Was it fair, they said, to punish men for crimes that had not existed in written form before their commission? The defendants had raised this argument during the trial itself. Göring, defiant and shrewd, had called it hypocrisy. The victors, he said, are merely punishing us for losing the war. You do the same things, only you call them peace. His words had been dismissed then, but they lingered afterward. Legal scholars called it the problem of retroactivity, the notion that law must be known before it is enforced. The Latin phrase nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without law, became the cornerstone of the debate. Nuremberg, some argued, had violated that principle. The judges had anticipated this challenge. In their judgment, they wrote that the crimes charged were not new inventions, but codifications of principles already recognized by civilized nations. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, they noted, had declared aggressive war illegal, and the Hague Conventions had outlawed the mistreatment of civilians and prisoners. The tribunal, they said, had merely enforced what humanity already knew to be right. But the debate did not end there. For the first time in modern history, morality and law had stood together on trial, and even those who admired the verdicts could not escape the tension between them. Some critics saw a political imbalance in the tribunal's very structure. Four Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had judged the defeated enemy, yet none of their own actions had been examined. The bombing of Dresden, the firestorms that consumed Hamburg and Tokyo, and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were never placed in the dock. Nor were the Soviet massacres at Katyn, where thousands of Polish officers were executed in secret. The same Soviets who had presented evidence in court had themselves been guilty of the crime of aggression when they invaded Poland in 1939. Yet the tribunal never questioned it. To many observers, this silence stained the purity of Nuremberg's moral claim. Philosophers struggled with this contradiction. Could justice be both righteous and selective? Could truth survive when spoken by victors alone? Some, like the British jurist Hersch Lauterpacht, defended the tribunal as a necessary beginning. Perfection, he wrote, is the enemy of creation. If justice waits until it is pure, it will never arrive. Others, more skeptical, warned that history would see Nuremberg not as the dawn of law, but as a reflection of power disguised in robes of virtue. The Soviet role in the tribunal deepened the unease. Judge Iona Nikitchenko, rigid and unsmiling, had declared before the trials even began that the defendants were guilty and would be punished. His presence symbolized a contradiction at the heart of Nuremberg, that a nation which had used terror and show trials at home now helped define international justice abroad. During the proceedings, the Soviets introduced evidence blaming the Germans for the Katyn massacre, though documents later revealed it had been their own doing. The tribunal sidestepped the issue, neither confirming nor denying. For many, this silence was damning. It proved that even in a court of law, truth could bend under the weight of politics. Yet for all the criticism, there remained a deeper truth that even the skeptics could not ignore. The crimes of the Reich were unlike anything the world had seen. To leave them unpunished would have been to abandon morality altogether. The defense of Victor's justice rang hollow in the face of gas chambers and mass graves. No one, not even the most cautious scholar, could argue that the architects of genocide should have been left to history's mercy alone. The question was not whether they deserved punishment, but whether the manner of punishment had created a standard that others might one day follow, even against the powerful. The irony was that the very nations accused of selective justice would themselves, decades later, face the same principles they had once imposed. The idea that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable would become a universal standard. The Nuremberg Charter, for all its imperfections, laid the foundation for laws that would one day reach far beyond Germany, to Yugoslavia, to Rwanda, to The Hague. The criticisms, in time, became part of the very evolution they had questioned. In Germany itself, the phrase Victor's justice took on complex shades of meaning. For many citizens, the trials had been both humiliation and liberation. At first, they rejected them as foreign impositions, designed to shame a defeated nation. But as years passed and evidence mounted, denial gave way to reflection. The photographs, the films, the testimonies of survivors all were undeniable. Slowly, Nuremberg's meaning shifted from punishment to education. By the 1960 seconds, German schools were teaching the history of the trials not as injustice, but as moral awakening. What had once been called Victor's justice became, for a new generation, justice itself. Still, the debate never vanished entirely. In neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland, commentators continued to question the legitimacy of trying men under laws written by their enemies. In Japan, where similar tribunals had been held, the echoes of the argument were even louder. There, too, the victors judged, and there, too, critics asked whether justice could exist in the shadow of conquest. The moral paradox of Nuremberg became a global mirror, reflecting humanity's eternal struggle between principle and power. Among theologians, the discussion took a spiritual turn. Was it divine justice that had been done, or merely human retribution wrapped in ceremony? The images of the gallows troubled many believers. They wondered whether hanging men, even monsters, could restore the balance of good and evil. Some priests prayed for the souls of the condemned. Others refused to speak their names. Justice, they said, had been necessary, but forgiveness, too, must find its place. The world, still scarred by war, was not ready to decide which mattered more. In time, as decades passed, the sharpness of the criticism softened. History has a way of sanding the rough edges of argument. What remained of the phrase Victor's justice was less accusation than caution, a reminder that even the noblest acts must guard against hypocrisy. Nuremberg's defenders came to embrace the criticism as part of its legacy. They admitted that the tribunal had been imperfect, that politics had shaped its course, but they insisted that imperfection did not nullify principle. As one prosecutor later said, "If only the victors could judge, then let them at least judge rightly." That was the paradox of Nuremberg, that justice born of victory could still be real, even if incomplete. The Allies had judged their enemies, but, in doing so, had also judged themselves, setting standards that their own future actions would be measured against. The tribunal, for all its human flaws, had forced the world to recognize that morality must not depend on circumstance. And in that recognition lay the first fragile step toward something greater, the idea that law could one day be universal. When later generations looked back, they saw not hypocrisy, but beginning. The questions raised by Nuremberg became the framework for every international court that followed. Each tribunal from Tokyo to The Hague wrestled with the same dilemma: how to balance power with principle, how to punish without vengeance. how to make justice serve not the victors, but humanity itself. Thus, the phrase that once haunted Nuremberg became its legacy. Victor's justice was no longer a condemnation but a challenge, a demand that future courts do better, reach higher, judge more fairly. The tribunal's imperfections became its greatest lesson. It showed that even when born of power, justice could aspire to transcend it. In the quiet reflection of history, Nuremberg endures not as the final word, but as the first. Its critics were right to question, for without questioning, justice stagnates. But they were also wrong to dismiss, for without action, evil thrives. Between these two truths, between doubt and duty, the world found its moral compass. And so, as the century turned and new atrocities arose, the name of Nuremberg carried both warning and hope. It whispered across time that justice must always stand watchful against its own shadow, that fairness must be measured not only by whom it judges but how it does so. In the end, the tribunal's legacy was not purity but persistence, the stubborn belief that, despite all its flaws, law could still speak for humanity. The debate faded, as all debates do, but its echo remained. Somewhere between triumph and doubt, between judgment and mercy, Nuremberg had drawn the line, and though the line was imperfect, it was there carved into the conscience of the world, the legacy of law and conscience. When the last sentences were read and the final prisoners were led away from the Palace of Justice, it seemed for a moment that history had reached a conclusion. The war had ended, the verdicts were delivered, and justice, however imperfect, had spoken. Yet in truth, Nuremberg was not an ending at all. It was a beginning. Beneath the ashes of destruction, something had been born, an idea so fragile that it trembled like a candle in the wind, yet strong enough to light the path of the century to come. It was the belief that conscience could be written into law, that morality could have a voice among nations, and that even power could be made to answer to principle. For centuries, war had been seen as the privilege of states, its conduct beyond moral scrutiny. Victors dictated peace, vanquished nations bore shame, but no court had ever dared to judge the act of war itself. At Nuremberg, that changed forever. Aggression, once celebrated as glory, had been declared a crime. Leaders who had waged war for conquest now stood condemned not by their enemies' armies, but by their enemies' laws. And in that transformation lay the quiet revolution of the modern world. The judges had written a new rule into the grammar of civilization, that to start a war of aggression was not merely a matter of politics, but of guilt. This principle would echo through the years that followed, influencing every treaty, every charter, every fragile attempt to keep peace. The United Nations Charter, drafted almost alongside the trials, enshrined the rejection of aggressive war as one of its founding purposes. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded upon the laws of war, embedding protections for civilians and prisoners that had been trampled during the conflict. The very language of these conventions bore the mark of Nuremberg, the awareness that cruelty, once justified as necessity, must now be bound by law. In lecture halls and courtrooms, the phrase Nuremberg Principles began to appear, quietly at first, then boldly. These principles distilled the essence of the tribunal into 7 declarations, among them that individuals could be held responsible for crimes under international law, that following orders was no defense, and that heads of state were not immune from accountability. The world had heard these ideas in Nuremberg's solemn chamber, but now they were inked into doctrine. For the first time, the law recognized that evil had no flag. Yet this transformation was not only legal, it was moral. The trial had shown that law, by itself, was fragile, that it could be twisted by ideology, corrupted by power, and silenced by fear. What gave Nuremberg its enduring force was not its statutes, but its spirit, the idea that conscience must stand as the final measure of justice. When the doctors of the Reich claimed that their experiments were scientific progress, the tribunal answered that knowledge divorced from humanity was not science, but sin. When the judges of the Reich insisted they were bound by national law, the tribunal replied that law without morality was tyranny in disguise. Each judgment reaffirmed that conscience must govern even the most powerful instruments of state. The effect of these ideas rippled outward across the globe. In the years after the trial, nations newly freed from colonial rule looked to Nuremberg as proof that justice could be international, that moral law need not bow to empire. Leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America quoted the tribunal when demanding accountability for oppression. Activists fighting apartheid in South Africa invoked its principles to condemn racial laws. Dissidents in the Soviet bloc whispered its name when appealing to the world against totalitarianism. Nuremberg had become more than a place, it had become a symbol of hope, an emblem of conscience, armed with truth. In the universities of America, Britain, and France, students of law studied the transcripts not as relics, but as scripture. Professors spoke of Robert Jackson's opening address, his declaration that the record we make here will stand as a warning to future tyrants. His words, once meant for a single courtroom, had become the foundation of modern international law. In Germany, young scholars examined the same words with a different reverence, seeing in them a mirror for their nation's own soul. Slowly, painfully, a new generation began to rebuild not only their cities but their morality. Still, Nuremberg's legacy was not without contradictions. The Cold War soon divided the world that the tribunal had sought to unite. East and West turned its ideals into weapons against one another. The Soviets cited Nuremberg when denouncing American aggression in Korea. The Americans cited it when condemning Soviet repression in Hungary. Both claimed to stand for justice. Yet both wielded the memory of Nuremberg as a tool of propaganda. The principles survived, but they were caught in the crossfire of ideology. Even within the United States, the clarity of Nuremberg met the fog of politics. When American forces later found themselves accused of atrocities in Vietnam, the same standards invoked at Nuremberg returned to challenge their legitimacy. The question arose again: could justice be universal or only convenient? The answers were never simple, but the debate itself was proof of Nuremberg's power, for even when nations failed to meet its ideals, they could not escape its shadow. For the survivors who had testified, the tribunal's legacy was not written in legal texts, but in memory. Many lived quietly after the war, their faces lined by the years, their voices gentle when recalling what they had seen. They spoke to schools, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. Some became teachers, others writers or historians. Their stories, recorded in the Nuremberg archives, became the heartbeat of the 20th century's conscience. Through them, the law's cold precision was warmed by the human voice. Over time, those voices began to fade, one by one, until only their words remained. But by then, the institutions, inspired by Nuremberg, had begun to take root. When the world faced new horrors in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, it turned again to the model first, built in 1945. Tribunals rose in The Hague and Arusha, carrying forward the same mission: to give the victims of cruelty a forum, to give the perpetrators a reckoning, and to remind humanity that even after the darkest crimes, the law could still speak. In 2002, that legacy reached its culmination with the creation of the International Criminal Court. The judges who assembled there, in a modern glass building beneath the same gray European sky, worked in the shadow of Nuremberg. On their walls hung photographs of the Palace of Justice. In their libraries, the transcripts of 1,946 lay bound in solemn volumes. Their mission was global now, their reach transcending borders. When they tried warlords and tyrants, they did so not in the name of victory, but in the name of the principle that no man was beyond justice. The circle begun in Nuremberg had closed, yet its meaning had grown larger than its founders could ever have imagined. But the true legacy of Nuremberg cannot be measured in laws or courts alone. Its greatest achievement lies in the quiet transformation of conscience. It taught the world to see individuals within systems, to recognize that responsibility cannot be dissolved into hierarchy, The defense of "I was only following orders" had once seemed sufficient. Now it was an admission of guilt. The world learned, through that trial, that obedience without thought was not virtue but surrender. Soldiers, doctors, officials, all were reminded that morality is not given by authority but demanded by humanity. This lesson found its way into classrooms, into military academies, into the small choices of everyday life. It became part of the unspoken understanding that defines civilization. When people stood up against tyranny in later decades, in Prague, in Gdańsk, in Cape Town, in Seoul, they did so carrying the belief that conscience was stronger than command. In a quiet way, that was Nuremberg's greatest triumph. Not the verdicts of the guilty, but the awakening of the innocent. And yet, as with all human achievements, the legacy of Nuremberg is both luminous and fragile. For every generation that honors its lessons, another arises that forgets. Wars still rage, leaders still lie, and atrocities still unfold behind closed borders. Each time, the world returns to the same question: will we remember? The answer lies not in the halls of The Hague or the charters of the United Nations, but in the hearts of ordinary people. For the law, however noble, is only as strong as the conscience that enforces it. Nuremberg proved that humanity could rise above vengeance, that even in the ruins of civilization, reason could prevail. But it also warned that justice must be renewed with every generation, or else it will fade into ceremony. The trial's documents, its photographs, its endless pages of testimony, all are relics now. Yet their meaning remains alive in the quiet conviction that morality is not the property of nations, but the duty of mankind. As the decades pass, the Palace of Justice still stands in Nuremberg, its stones weathered, its halls repurposed. Tourists walk through its corridors, where once the world's greatest trial unfolded. The benches are polished now, the microphones replaced, the dark air filled not with accusation, but with memory. Guides speak softly of what happened there, their voices echoing under the vaulted ceilings. Outside, the city hums with life, unaware that it was once the stage upon which the moral fate of the century was decided. But for those who pause and listen, truly listen, the echoes are still there. The gavel striking wood, the rustle of papers, the measured voices of translators repeating justice into many tongues. The sound is faint, but it endures, like the conscience of the world whispering through time. The legacy of Nuremberg is not perfection, it is perseverance. It is the belief that humanity, though flawed, can still choose decency over destruction, principle over power. It is the memory of a courtroom where law and conscience stood side by side and, for a fleeting moment, held evil to account. That memory, fragile but eternal, is what we inherit and what we must never let go. The memory of Nuremberg time, that gentle eraser, of noise and fury, has a way of softening even the sharpest moments of history. Yet there are some events that resist its fading touch. The Nuremberg Trials belong to that rare company of memories that refuse to dissolve. They live not in the headlines or monuments alone, but in the quiet corners of collective remembrance in classrooms, in museums, in the whispered recollections of those who lived through the age of its shadow. Decades have passed since those days when the world sat in judgment upon itself, yet the memory of Nuremberg remains, steady and luminous, like an eternal flame burning against the wind of forgetting. When the last of the judges died, and the defendants became names rather than faces, the meaning of Nuremberg began to change. It moved from the immediacy of justice to the permanence of memory. The transcripts and testimonies that once filled the courtroom became relics, bound in heavy volumes resting on library shelves. But for every student who opened those pages, for every visitor who stepped into the courtroom preserved as a museum, the story began again. The voices of prosecutors and witnesses, long silenced by age, still echoed through the written word. The trial had ended, but its memory had taken on a life of its own, one that belonged not to lawyers or nations, but to humanity. The first generation to inherit this memory carried its weight like a wound. In Germany, the legacy of Nuremberg was a difficult inheritance. For many, it represented humiliation, the shame of defeat, the exposure of national guilt. Families avoided speaking of it. Veterans dismissed it as propaganda, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Photographs of emaciated bodies, testimonies of survivors, and the films shown in the courtroom made denial impossible. As the years went by, a quiet reckoning began. Teachers introduced the trials into the curriculum. Churches held memorial services for the victims. The young began to ask questions their elders could not easily answer. And in that uncomfortable questioning, a nation slowly began to heal. For survivors, Nuremberg was not a distant symbol, but a living chapter of their lives. Many who had stood as witnesses later devoted their years to ensuring that no one would forget. They traveled to schools, spoke to children, and recorded their memories for archives. Their voices trembled but did not falter. Each testimony was an act of faith that the truth could outlive them. Some returned to Nuremberg in later years, standing once more in the courtroom that had once felt so vast, now quiet and still. They would look at the benches, the judge's platform, the place where their pain had been spoken aloud, and they would whisper, "It mattered." Museums rose in their honor, each shaped by the lessons of Nuremberg. In Washington, in Jerusalem, in Berlin, exhibits displayed photographs and documents from the trial. Behind glass, the viewer could see the faces of the accused, the evidence of the crimes, the signature of justice written in black ink. The museums were not meant to inspire hatred, but reflection. They told the visitor that civilization is fragile, that the law is only as strong as those who believe in it. The memory of Nuremberg was not built upon triumph, but upon warning. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Yad Vashem Memorial in Israel, and countless smaller institutions across Europe all carried fragments of the same story. Visitors walked in silence through rooms lined with testimony. In one display, a projection of the Nuremberg courtroom flickered softly, the judges in their robes, the translators at their booths, the defendants listening through headphones. For many, seeing this footage for the first time felt like stepping into a moment when the world had paused to confront itself. The courtroom had become a shrine to accountability. But memory, like justice, is never absolute. As the survivors aged and passed away, the drain to a day, burden of remembrance fell to those who had not seen the war. Historians became its caretakers, educators, its guardians. They turned the dusty transcripts into living stories, adapting them for documentaries, books, and lessons. Filmmakers recreated the trials, their soft narration echoing through television screens late at night, allowing new generations to witness the moral gravity that once held the world spellbound. The glow of black and white footage carried into the modern age, bridging the gap between those who had lived it and those who could only imagine. Still, even memory can face denial. As the 20th century drew to a close, whispers of revisionism began to emerge. There were those who claimed that the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that Nuremberg had been theater, that history itself was propaganda. Such voices, though few, found audiences among the disillusioned, but against them stood the record millions of pages, photographs, films, testimonies too vast to distort. Nuremberg's meticulous documentation had been its greatest defense against the erosion of truth. The prosecutors, who insisted that every crime be recorded, every name preserved, had unknowingly built a fortress of memory stronger than any monument. When teachers faced the challenge of denial, they turned to that record. They showed their students the faces of the accused, the trembling words of witnesses, the calm logic of the prosecutors. They let the evidence speak, and it always did. For in those moments when humanity seemed to drift toward forgetfulness, Nuremberg rose again quiet, patient, unyielding, reminding the world of what it had once promised never to repeat. The memory of Nuremberg also changed the way nations mourned. Before it, remembrance had been local, confined to cemeteries and monuments. After it, memory became global. The crimes revealed in its courtroom were not seen as the tragedy of one people, but of all. When decades later, the world established Holocaust memorial days. They did so in the spirit of Nuremberg as acts of collective remembrance. Transcending borders, candles were lit in Tokyo, in Buenos Aires, in Cape Town, each flame a silent echo of that courtroom where truth had first been spoken aloud. In art, too, the shadow of Nuremberg stretched far. Painters depicted the emptiness of the dock, the solemn faces of the judges, the haunting presence of absence itself. Composers wrote symphonies inspired by its somber tone, slow, meditative works filled with quiet dissonance. Writers found in it the perfect metaphor for humanity's struggle between justice and cruelty. They wrote novels where conscience stood trial, plays where memory itself was the witness. In each, the theme was the same, that civilization's survival depended not on power, but on remembrance. As the century turned, the last living participants of Nuremberg began to pass away. Their funerals were small, attended by historians and family members who understood the weight of their lives. Yet each passing felt like the closing of a page. The world was entering an era where memory would belong entirely to those who had not seen. In Germany, the courtroom at Nuremberg was preserved, its benches polished, its walls restored. Tourists came, walking where justice once stood. Guides spoke softly, their voices echoing in the same chamber where Jackson and Göring had once exchanged words. Outside, the streets were filled with laughter and modern life, yet within those walls, time held still. For the elderly who visit, Nuremberg is not just history. It is a mirror of their youth, a reminder of the years when the world learned, painfully, what conscience meant. They walk through the courtroom with quiet steps, sometimes pausing to rest their hands on the railings. They remember radios whispering the verdicts, newspapers printed with the word guilty, and the feeling that, perhaps for once, the world had done the right thing. For them, the trial was not distant. It was a chapter in their own story. As new generations grow, the challenge of preserving that memory deepens. The trial is no longer a living event, but a lesson to be taught, a story to be told. Yet its power endures precisely because it was written not in victory, but in humility. It was a moment when humanity stood before the mirror and did not look away. That act, simple, painful, and rare, is what gives Nuremberg its timeless strength. The memory of Nuremberg is not about punishment or vengeance. It is about recognition, the recognition that even in the ruins of civilization, truth can still be spoken and justice can still be imagined. It is about the fragile yet enduring belief that what we do to one another matters, that morality is not erased by war, and that the world, though often cruel, can still choose to be kind. And so, though the courtroom is silent now, its echoes remain. They live in every declaration of human rights, in every law against genocide, in every act of remembrance. They live in the faint murmur of visitors who step into that chamber and feel, without quite knowing why, that they are standing in the presence of something sacred. For as long as humanity remembers, Nuremberg will remain not as a monument of stone, but as a memory carved into conscience. It will endure as long as people whisper its name, as long as teachers tell its story, as long as the world continues to believe that justice, even imperfect, is worth pursuing. The memory of Nuremberg is the memory of hope itself, quiet, solemn, unbreakable. Echoes of humanity. Long after the final verdicts had been spoken, after the gallows had been dismantled and the courtrooms emptied, something continued to resonate faintly at first, then with quiet persistence. It was not the echo of the judges' gavels, nor the measured words of prosecutors, but something softer, more enduring, the echo of humanity itself. It drifted beyond the walls of the Palace of Justice, beyond the ruins of Europe, into the consciousness of generations that had never seen the war. It was the sound of a world that, for the first time, had judged its own cruelty and found both shame and redemption. In that echo lay the strange beauty of Nuremberg, that even amid the rubble of moral collapse, humanity had chosen to speak, to reason, and to remember. The trials had shown not only what men could do to one another, but what they could still become when faced with the truth. It was not only the guilty who were on trial, but civilization itself, and civilization had chosen to answer. That answer, whispered through history, remains one of the faintest yet most profound sounds of the 20th century, the echo of humanity awakening to its own conscience. When the judges of Nuremberg spoke of crimes against humanity, they gave a name to suffering that had until then been nameless. They spoke of the deliberate murder of civilians, the extermination of entire peoples, the enslavement of innocents, and they declared that such acts, wherever committed, were offenses against all mankind. For the first time, the boundaries between nations, races, and creeds blurred in the face of universal morality. The idea was, both radical and simple, that compassion, not conquest, should define what it means to be human. In the quiet rhythm of their judgments, the judges wrote not only law but empathy. Those words, born in the silence after catastrophe, would travel far. They would reach countries that had never known the sound of bombers overhead. They would echo through universities, through parliaments, and through the minds of writers and artists. The idea that humanity was one that its suffering and dignity were shared became a moral cornerstone of the post-war world. Even as the Cold War divided nations, Nuremberg's whisper remained, reminding both sides that their ideologies were hollow if they forgot the sanctity of life itself. In the decades that followed, that echo could be heard in the language of human rights. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948, the words dignity and freedom carried the weight of Nuremberg behind them. The drafters knew the images that had shaped those terms, the skeletal figures behind barbed wire, the ashes of families turned to smoke. The trials had forced the world to look into the mirror of its own potential for evil, and in that reflection, humanity found the urgency to define its better self. The Declaration became, in spirit, the civilian counterpart of the Nuremberg judgment, the law of conscience written for every man and woman. But echoes do not travel only through laws. They move through the subtler realms of art, memory, and faith. Poets began to write of the tribunal as a cathedral of justice, where morality itself had stood trial and survived. Painters captured its mood in brushstrokes of gray and sepia, depicting not the faces of the accused, but the emptiness of the courtroom after judgment. In these works, Nuremberg was less an event than an emotion, a quiet assertion that even amid horror, beauty could still emerge through truth. In churches, sermons invoked its lessons. Priests spoke of Nuremberg as the moment when humanity had confessed its sins before the altar of law. They called it a turning point in the moral history of the world, a moment when nations, not individuals, repented. For believers and skeptics alike, the trials offered something akin to absolution, not through forgiveness, but through the courage to acknowledge guilt. In that sense, Nuremberg became a spiritual event as much as a legal one, a collective meditation on what it meant to be human after the unthinkable had been done. And yet, even as the echo of humanity spread, it carried with it sorrow. For every principle affirmed at Nuremberg, there remained the shadow of the crimes that had made it necessary. The knowledge that such atrocities had occurred, that they could be committed by ordinary men, lingered like a stain upon the conscience of the world. Historians wrote of the banality of evil, the terrifying truth that cruelty often wears the face of normalcy. The guards at the camps, the clerks who typed the orders, the engineers who built the crematoria, none were demons. They were human beings who had surrendered thought to obedience, conscience to ideology. That realization became one of Nuremberg's most haunting echoes. The recognition that humanity's greatest danger comes not from monsters, but from men who stop thinking. This echo found its way into classrooms and universities, where teachers no longer spoke of war only in terms of battles and treaties, but in terms of morality and choice. The students who listened were often born long after the guns had fallen silent, yet they understood the weight of those lessons. They saw in Nuremberg not a foreign event, but a mirror of their own world, a warning that evil was not confined to history, but always waiting in the silence of indifference. Each generation, it seemed, heard the echo in its own way, translating it into the language of its time. During the civil rights movements of the 1962, activists invoked the spirit of Nuremberg to condemn segregation and racism. They argued that injustice, wherever it occurred, was a crime against humanity in miniature. When protesters marched for equality, they carried the same moral conviction that had animated the prosecutors in 1945, that the dignity of one person was the dignity of all. Across continents, from South Africa to South America, from Eastern Europe to Asia, the lessons of Nuremberg became a rallying cry for justice. The echo had traveled far, and it spoke now not only of guilt, but of responsibility. In later years, as new wars broke out and new atrocities unfolded, the world once again turned to the memory of that trial. When tribunals were convened for the crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the judges quoted directly from Nuremberg's charter. The echo had become a foundation. The same principles, once revolutionary, were now assumed truths: that war crimes must be punished, that leaders could be held accountable, that the victims of injustice deserved their day in court. The architecture of international justice had been built upon the stones first laid in that German courtroom. But perhaps the most enduring echo of humanity lies not in institutions, but in empathy. The images shown at Nuremberg of camps, of suffering, of despair, had once stunned the world into silence. Now, decades later, they continued to serve as warnings and reminders. Every time the world witnessed new suffering, those old photographs seemed to awaken. They whispered through television screens and history books, saying softly, "You have seen this before." The memory of one atrocity became the conscience against another. In this way, Nuremberg had given humanity more than laws. It had given it language, the words to describe the unspeakable, the courage to confront it, and the humility to remember. It had transformed guilt into warning, pain into education, and history into a living guide. The echo of humanity that began in that courtroom has never fully faded. It lives in the moral vocabulary of our time in phrases like crimes against humanity, human rights, and never again. Each repetition is a small act of remembrance, a quiet continuation of that first moment, when the world chose to speak rather than turn away. Even today, in the soft hum of modern life, Nuremberg's echo can be felt in the debates of politicians, in the judgments of courts, in the reflections of citizens who still struggle to balance justice and mercy. It is not a loud echo, nor a triumphant one. It is humble, steady, patient, the kind of sound that lingers long after the music has stopped. It reminds us that humanity is both fragile and resilient, capable of unspeakable cruelty, yet equally capable of reflection and grace. And so the echo continues, passing from generation to generation, a moral inheritance that cannot be silenced. It asks each new listener the same quiet question: what will you do when the world forgets? For that, perhaps, is the truest measure of civilization, not whether we remember our triumphs, but whether we remember our failures with compassion and resolve. Nuremberg was the voice of humanity at its most fragile, speaking with the strength of truth. Its echoes now belong to all of us. They live in every law written to protect the innocent, in every protest against injustice, in every act of kindness that defies cruelty. They remind us that conscience, once awakened, never truly sleeps. It whispers in the heart of every age, urging us toward decency, toward empathy, toward the quiet courage of being human. And when the last witnesses are gone, when the last documents fade to dust, and the world grows restless with new distractions, that echo will still remain a soft, enduring murmur in the soul of mankind, repeating what Nuremberg once taught in the voice of eternity: that justice is not vengeance, that memory is not burden, and that humanity, for all its frailty, can still choose to be good. The final judgment. The Palace of Justice stands quietly now, its stone walls softened by decades of rain and sun. The windows that once framed the stern faces of prosecutors and judges look out upon a city at peace. The same city that once lay in ruins now hums with the ordinary rhythm of life, footsteps on cobblestone, the laughter of children, the whisper of wind over rooftops. Yet, beneath that calm, Nuremberg remains haunted by a presence both solemn and serene. It is not a haunting of ghosts, but of memory, a presence that lingers like a soft echo, reminding all who pass that once, within these walls, humanity judged itself. The courtroom, preserved as it was, feels smaller than the imagination remembers. The benches are polished now, the air still. Where once sat the architects of a war that consumed continents, there are only tourists, school groups, and a silence that seems to listen back. Yet, in that silence, the echoes of the trial remain: the murmur of translators, the rustle of papers, the steady cadence of a voice declaring, "Guilty." The sound of history, restrained and grave, still breathes faintly in the walls. It is a silence not of emptiness, but of reverence. The world that emerged from Nuremberg was weary but wiser. Out of the rubble of moral collapse came the fragile architecture of conscience, a framework of principles, laws, and institutions built to hold humanity accountable to itself. The trial had shown what could happen when law served evil, when obedience silenced thought, and when nations surrendered to the seduction of ideology. In its aftermath, the world resolved, however, imperfectly to prevent that descent again. It was an oath taken not in ceremony, but in quiet resolve. The judges had not only sentenced men, they had sentenced an era. The years that followed tested that resolve. Wars continued, atrocities returned in new forms and new places. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, names that echoed the same sorrow, the same disbelief. Each time, the world seemed to ask itself the same question: had we learned nothing? And yet, each time, it turned back to Nuremberg for guidance. The principles written in 1946 became the compass by which the conscience of the modern world tried to find its bearings. Even when it failed, even when silence or politics triumphed, the idea of justice born in that courtroom endured. To the generation that lived through the trial, Nuremberg was more than history. It was an awakening. They had seen a war that reduced morality to ashes, and then they had seen morality rise again, fragile but unbroken. To the generations that followed, Nuremberg became a lesson that civilization is not built by might, but by restraint, that power is only legitimate when tempered by conscience. The world learned that justice, even delayed, even flawed, was still the only antidote to despair. When the final executions were carried out, there were no cheers in the streets, no celebration. The world understood that justice, in its purest form, carries no joy. It is solemn, heavy, and quiet. The images of that night in October 1946 have long since faded to black and white, but the feeling remains. 10 men, each representing a fragment of tyranny, faced the reckoning of their own creation. It was not vengeance that lowered the trapdoors, but history itself, closing the chapter it had written in blood. And though their bodies turned to ashes, their crimes remained, suspended in memory as warnings for all time. The trial's documents became sacred in their own way. Millions of words, testimony, confessions, denials, all preserved like relics. Generations later, scholars still leaf through them, reading the cold precision of bureaucratic evil and the equally measured tone of those who condemned it. There is something almost unbearable in that symmetry, the same species capable of both atrocity and justice, of both cruelty and reflection. Nuremberg, more than any other moment, revealed that paradox. It proved that humanity's greatest weakness and greatest strength are born from the same mind, and perhaps that is why the memory of the trial continues to resonate. It reminds us that civilization is never secure, that morality is not inherited but chosen, again and again, with every generation. The men who stood trial were not monsters from another world. They were men of intellect, discipline, and ambition, men who believed in order, in duty, in destiny. And that is the warning. Evil does not arrive with horns and fire. It comes dressed in purpose, reason, and calm conviction. It comes when the human heart forgets its capacity for empathy. Nuremberg did not merely punish the guilty, it exposed the anatomy of obedience. The tribunal also gave the world something else, a vision of courage, the courage of witnesses who faced the men who had destroyed their families, the courage of judges who held firm amid pressure and politics, the courage of nations to rise above revenge and to choose law instead. These small acts of dignity are what gave Nuremberg its moral light. In the shadows of atrocity, they glimmered like stars seen through smoke, faint but real. And it was enough. As decades passed, the meaning of Nuremberg deepened. It ceased to be only about one war, one people, or one set of crimes. It became a mirror held up to every society that would ever face its own failings. From truth commissions in South Africa to international courts in The Hague, the same moral thread runs back to that German courtroom. Each effort to confront evil, each attempt to reconcile justice and mercy, is an echo of that first judgment. Nuremberg's true legacy is not in the verdicts it rendered, but in the questions it left behind, questions the world must continue to answer. What is justice when all sides have sinned? What is forgiveness when memory still bleeds? How do you punish evil without becoming it? These questions have no final answer, and perhaps that is the point. Nuremberg's greatness lies not in its perfection, but in its persistence, its insistence that humanity keep asking, keep striving, keep remembering. The trial was not a conclusion, but a conversation between generations, one that continues, quietly, in the conscience of every person who wonders what it means to be good in a world capable of so much harm. For the elderly who remember those days, Nuremberg is a moment of clarity preserved within time, a brief, solemn pause between chaos and rebuilding. For the young, it is a story told in low voices, a lesson that goodness must never sleep. Each time its name is spoken, the courtroom awakens a little, the wooden benches creak, the echoes stir, the walls remember. There are few places in the world where morality feels tangible, where the very air carries the weight of conscience. Nuremberg is one of them. As the evening falls over the city today, the Palace of Justice glows faintly in the twilight. The same light that once shone upon despair now rests upon peace. Somewhere within those walls, the memory of the judges endures their patience, their solemnity, their faith in the idea that reason could heal what hatred had destroyed. Perhaps that is humanity's greatest hope, that after every war, after every fall, we still believe in justice enough to build it again. The final judgment of Nuremberg, then, was not the hanging of men, nor the sentencing of crimes, but the quiet realization that humanity can, even after its darkest hour, look at itself and choose to stand upright once more. It was the understanding that law, though written by the hands of men, can still speak with the voice of morality. That understanding is what gives the trial its immortality. And so, the story closes, not with triumph, but with reflection. The world has moved on, but the meaning remains. The verdict of Nuremberg is still being written every day, in every act of justice, in every refusal to forget, in every defense of human dignity. It is written each time the powerful are held to account, each time the weak are given a voice, each time someone stands and says, softly but firmly, never again. The final judgment is not in the past, it lives in the choices of the present. For as long as humanity remembers, as long as conscience endures, Nuremberg will never be over. It will continue to whisper across time, a calm, enduring reminder that the true test of civilization is not in its victories, but in its compassion. And so, as the lights fade on the courtroom of history, we are left with silence, the kind that invites reflection. The story of Nuremberg is not only the story of justice, but of remembrance, of what it means to be human, even after the darkest of nights. If you found peace in this journey through time, if the quiet rhythm of history helps you rest, reflect, and dream, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Lullaby of Empires for more calm, gentle stories from the past, tales that remind us that even in the ruins of empires, the human spirit endures. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, and your dreams filled with history's softest echoes. And perhaps that is the point. Nuremberg's greatness lies not in its perfection, but in its persistence, its insistence that humanity keep asking, Keep striving, keep remembering. The trial was not a conclusion, but a conversation between generations, one that continues, quietly, in the conscience of every person who wonders what it means to be good in a world capable of so much harm. For the elderly who remember those days, Nuremberg is a moment of clarity preserved within time, a brief, solemn pause between chaos and rebuilding. For the young, it is a story told in low voices, a lesson that goodness must never sleep. Each time its name is spoken, the courtroom awakens a little, the wooden benches creak, the echoes stir, the walls remember. There are few places in the world where morality feels tangible, where the very air carries the weight of conscience. Nuremberg is one of them. As the evening falls over the city today, the Palace of Justice glows faintly in the twilight. The same light that once shone upon despair now rests upon peace. Somewhere within those walls, the memory of the judges endures their patience, their solemnity, their faith in the idea that reason could heal what hatred had destroyed. Perhaps that is humanity's greatest hope, that after every war, after every fall, we still believe in justice enough to build it again. The final judgment of Nuremberg, then, was not the hanging of men, nor the sentencing of crimes, but the quiet realization that humanity can, even after its darkest hour, look at itself and choose to stand upright once more. It was the understanding that law, though written by the hands of men, can still speak with the voice of morality. That understanding is what gives the trial its immortality. And so, the story closes, not with triumph, but with reflection. The world has moved on, but the meaning remains. The verdict of Nuremberg is still being written every day, in every act of justice, in every refusal to forget, in every defense of human dignity. It is written each time the powerful are held to account, each time the weak are given a voice, each time someone stands and says, softly but firmly, never again. The final judgment is not in the past. It lives in the choices of the present. For as long as humanity remembers, as long as conscience endures, Nuremberg will never be over. It will continue to whisper across time, a calm, enduring reminder that the true test of civilization is not in its victories, but in its compassion. And so, as the lights fade on the courtroom of history, we are left with silence, the kind that invites reflection. The story of Nuremberg is not only the story of justice, but of remembrance, of what it means to be human, even after the darkest of nights. If you found peace in this journey through time, if the quiet rhythm of history helps you rest, reflect, and dream, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Lullaby of Empires for more calm, gentle stories from the past, tales that remind us that even in the ruins of empires, the human spirit endures. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, and your dreams filled with history's softest echoes.